Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I'm a folklorist. That means I study old stories people tell each other, especially the scary ones that get passed down through families. In 1973, I was 34 and working on my PhD at Georgetown University. My marriage had just fallen apart, and I threw myself into my research like a woman drowning throws herself at a life preserver. My colleagues thought I was wasting my time. Supernatural folklore, they'd say with those condescending smiles. Not very scientific, Eleanor. They wanted me to study something more respectable, more academic. But I believed those old stories mattered. I just didn't know how much. That's how I ended up in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, looking for a place called Hendricks Hollow. The map showed it tucked away near Blackwater Falls, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road. Population 47. No phone service for 15 miles. It took me 3 days to find someone willing to guide me there. Jerry Winters was sitting on the porch of a general store in Davis, whittling a piece of pine and watching the road like he expected trouble. He was maybe 62, with hands that looked like tree roots and eyes the color of creek water. When I told him where I wanted to go, he stopped whittling. Hendricks Hollow? He tested the words, like they might bite him. What for? I'm documenting Appalachian oral traditions. The stories families tell about supernatural encounters. I've heard there are some interesting legends in the hollow. Jerry's knife stayed still. Ain't legends, miss. Ain't stories neither. I offered him $200. In 1973, that was serious money for a man who looked like he'd never seen the inside of a bank. But Jerry stared at that money for a long time before he took it. My wife ain't gonna like this, he said. Neither will my mother-in-law. Why not? He folded the bills carefully and put them in his shirt pocket. You'll see. The next morning, Jerry picked me up in a rusted pickup truck that sounded like it was dying. I'd loaded my equipment in the back. Professional recording gear, notebooks, a camera with flash attachments, camping supplies. Jerry looked at my gear and shook his head. Won't do you much good where we're going, he said. Why not? Instead of answering, he reached behind his seat and pulled out a shotgun. Then he showed me a box of shells. Even in the dim morning light, I could see they weren't regular bullets. They had a silvery shine. Silver? I asked. My grandmother made them, Jerry said. Melted down her wedding ring and some old coins. Said silver was the only thing that worked. I almost laughed. This was exactly the kind of primitive superstition I was studying. But something in Jerry's voice stopped me. He wasn't joking. We drove through forest that seemed to get darker the deeper we went. The trees grew so thick overhead that noon looked like evening. Jerry didn't talk much, but when he did, it was to point out landmarks. That's where the Morrison boy went missing. 1967. Found him 3 days later. He paused, found what was left of him. What happened? Same thing that always happens in the hollow. Boy got hungry. I wrote everything down. This was exactly the kind of local folklore I needed for my research. Stories about missing children were common in isolated mountain communities. Usually, they reflected real dangers. Wild animals, accidents, strangers passing through. But the supernatural elements interested me more. They showed how communities processed trauma, turned inexplicable loss into something they could understand and control. Jerry, I said, tell me about these hungry children. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Ain't children no more. Ain't hungry for food, neither. We reached Hendricks Hollow as the sun was setting. It was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe a dozen houses scattered along a creek, with a tiny white church, and what might have been a general store. The houses looked old but well-maintained, with gardens and chicken coops and clotheslines. Normal, except for one thing. Every house had iron nails driven into the doorframes, not decorative nails. Thick, ugly railroad spikes hammered deep into the wood, and every yard was surrounded by a thin line of white salt, Jerry said when he saw me looking. Keeps things out. A woman came out of one of the houses as we parked. She was maybe 50, with graying hair and eyes that held too much knowledge. "Jeremiah Winters, what have you done?" she called. "Mabel, this is Dr. Hartwell. She's here to study our stories." Mabel Winters looked at me like I was carrying a disease. "Stories ain't for outsiders." "Ma'am, I'm a researcher. I'm documenting." "I know what you're documenting." Mabel's voice was flat. "Question is, do you know what you're really asking about?" An old woman appeared in Mabel's doorway. She had to be 80, bent over a wooden cane, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. She looked at me for a long moment. "Martha," Jerry said, "this is the professor I told you about." Martha hobbled down the porch steps. When she reached me, she grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like bird bones. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You got the look," she said. "What look?" "Same look as the others, the ones who come asking questions." She released my wrist. "Same look as my brother had, right before they took him." I spent that first evening going door to door, introducing myself and asking if anyone would share their family stories. Most people were polite but distant. A few slammed doors in my face. But some talked, and what they told me was remarkably consistent. The stories always involved children, always involved hunger, and always ended the same way, with pale, thin figures taking children into the forest, and those children coming back wrong. "Empty," one woman told me, like someone took out everything that made them human and left just the shell. By the time Jerry showed me where I could set up my camp, in a clearing just outside the hollow, I had 14 different versions of the same basic story. The details varied, but the core remained constant. Something in the forest fed on children and had been doing it for generations. I fell asleep that night thinking about trauma, narratives, and collective memory. I thought I understood what I was dealing with. I thought the stories were metaphors. I was wrong. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of children singing. It wasn't unusual for me to hear sounds while camping. Wind through trees, animals moving through underbrush, streams running over rocks. But this was different. These were human voices. Young voices, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The melody was haunting and unfamiliar, but some of the words were clear. "Sleep now, sleep deep, dream of warm places. We're coming to play." With smiling faces, I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like they were rising out of the ground itself. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The clearing was empty. I walked to the edge of the forest, shining my light into the trees. Nothing, but the singing continued, always just out of reach, always just beyond my light. I went back to my tent and checked my equipment. The recording device was running, and when I played it back, the singing was there. Faint but unmistakable. Multiple children's voices, harmonizing perfectly. I made notes. Possible explanation: local children playing elaborate prank on outsider researcher. However, singing occurred at 3 a.m. in near-freezing temperatures. Unlikely children would be outdoors. Need to investigate further. The next morning, Jerry found me pale and exhausted over my coffee. "Didn't sleep well?" he asked. I told him about the singing. His face went stone still. "What did they sing about?" I repeated what I could remember. Jerry was quiet for a long time. "They're getting bolder," he said finally. "Who's getting bolder?" "The hungry ones. Usually they wait longer before showing themselves to outsiders." That day, Jerry took me deeper into the forest to show me what he called the cold places. These were areas where the temperature dropped dramatically for no apparent reason. I had brought a thermometer, and in these spots it registered 20 to 30 degrees colder than the surrounding forest. "Why is it so cold here?" I asked. "Death is cold," Jerry said, "and this is where they do their feeding." I took pictures of these areas. When I developed the film later, I noticed something odd. In several photos, there were shapes in the background that I hadn't seen when I took the pictures. Pale, elongated figures standing among the trees, just at the edge of visibility. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The figures appeared to be watching us. "Probably just tricks of light and shadow," I wrote in my notes. Pareidolia, the tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. However, the consistency of the apparitions across multiple photographs is noteworthy. But I was starting to feel uneasy. The next day, I asked Jerry to show me where the Morrison boy had been found. He reluctantly led me to a small clearing about a mile from the hollow. The ground was bare dirt, Nothing growing there despite the rich forest soil everywhere else. Found him right there, Jerry said, pointing to the center of the clearing. Just lying on the ground like he was sleeping. You said you found what was left of him. What did that mean? Jerry was quiet for a long time. Boy was still breathing, eyes still open, even answered when you called his name. But there wasn't nothing left inside. Like something had drained out everything that made Tommy Morrison who he was. I knelt and examined the ground. There were objects half buried in the dirt, small things that looked out of place. I brushed away soil and found a child's marble, a hair ribbon, a small metal toy car. All looked old, but showed no signs of weathering. How long have these been here? I asked. Jerry looked at the items like they were poisonous snakes. Could be days, could be decades. Time works different in the cold places. That night, I woke again to singing. This time I was ready. I grabbed my recording equipment and followed the sound. It led me to the edge of the clearing, then into the forest itself. I pushed through undergrowth, following voices that always seemed just ahead of me. The forest grew darker as I went deeper. My flashlight beam seemed weak, like it was being absorbed by the darkness around me. But the singing grew stronger. And then I saw them. Children. Maybe 6 or 7 of them, standing in a circle in a small clearing. They were pale. Not just white skin, but pale all over, like they'd been drained of color. Their hair was white blonde, their clothes were white, even their eyes seemed colorless in my flashlight beam. They were singing the same lullaby I'd heard before. But up close, I could understand more of the words. Asterisk, new friend comes walking. Asterisk, asterisk, new friend comes near. Asterisk, asterisk, new friend has something. Asterisk, asterisk. We want to hear. Asterisk. I fumbled with my recording equipment. This was it. Actual evidence of the children from the stories. But as I raised my camera, they turned to look at me. Their faces were wrong, not deformed exactly, but empty. Like someone had erased their personalities and left just the basic features. And when they smiled, their teeth looked too sharp. "Hello, teacher lady," one of them said. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to run. But somehow, no matter which direction I went, I ended up back in the clearing with the pale children. They giggled and clapped their hands like it was a game. "Don't run," said a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8. "We want to show you something special. Something just for teachers who ask too many questions." That's when Jerry appeared, crashing through the underbrush with his shotgun raised. The children scattered like mist, melting back into the forest so quickly I almost wondered if I'd imagined them. "Eleanor," Jerry grabbed my arm. "What are you doing out here?" I was following the singing. There were children. No children in these woods, not anymore. Jerry's face was grim. "What you saw were the empty ones, the ones they took and sent back." He led me back to my camp, but I couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, from the memory of those empty faces, those 2 sharp smiles. "Jerry," I said as we walked, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" "Something that's been hungry for a very long time," he said. "Something that won't stop until it feeds." I lay in my tent the rest of the night, listening to my recordings. The children's voices were clear on the tape, but underneath them was something else. A deeper sound, like wind through caves. Like breathing, like something vast and patient waiting in the darkness. I was beginning to understand that whatever was happening in Hendricks Hollow, it wasn't folklore. It wasn't metaphor. It was real. And it had noticed me. The next morning, Martha was waiting for me at my campsite. The old woman had walked all the way from the hollow, leaning heavily on her cane, just to talk to me. "You met them last night," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "My brother was the same age as you when it happened. Same kind of curiosity, same need to understand things that ought to be left alone." She sat down heavily on a fallen log. 1921. It was terrible cold winter, and people were desperate. But Joseph wouldn't listen to the warnings, kept saying the old stories were just superstition. What happened to him? They found him in the cold places, just like Jerry told you about the Morrison boy. Still alive, still breathing, still looked like Joseph. But everything that made him my brother was gone. Like they'd drunk it all up and left just the empty cup behind. Martha reached into her coat and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. But there was something else in the picture. a pale figure standing behind him, barely visible in the shadows. "This was taken the day before they got him," Martha said. "You can see one of them watching. They always watch before they take." I studied the photograph. The pale figure was nearly transparent, but definitely there, just like in my own photos. Mrs. Winters. What exactly are these things? Started with the first mother, Martha said. German woman named Greta Zimmer. Came here with her family in 1847, during the hard times. Her children starved that first winter, and something in her broke. Made a deal with something dark, something that promised she'd never lose another child to hunger. But the price was that she'd have to feed it other people's children instead. That's impossible. Martha laughed bitterly. Girl, you met them last night. You think impossible means anything anymore? She told me about the cave system that ran under the entire hollow, limestone tunnels that connected to a central chamber where Greta Zimmer still waited. The children I'd seen were her servants, empty shells she sent out to bring back fresh victims. Every month, when the moon goes dark, she gets hungry again. And every month, we lose someone if we're not careful. That afternoon, Jerry reluctantly agreed to show me the cave entrance. It was hidden behind a waterfall about 2 miles from the hollow, marked with warnings carved into the stone in old German script. What do they say? I asked. Jerry translated slowly. Here waits der Hungrige, the hungry one. Enter and feed her, or she will come to feed on you. The cave mouth was black as pitch, and cold air flowed out of it like breath. My thermometer read 43 degrees at the entrance, while the outside temperature was 72. I could hear sounds from deep inside, not quite human voices, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I need to go in there, I said. No, Jerry's voice was firm. Absolutely not. Jerry, I'm a researcher. This is what I do. I document things, I investigate, I try to understand. Some things ain't meant to be understood. Some things are meant to be feared and avoided and forgotten. But I couldn't forget. That night, I dreamed about the pale children singing their lullaby. I dreamed about empty eyes and sharp teeth, and something vast and hungry waiting in the darkness underground. I woke with my hair damp with sweat and a terrible certainty growing in my chest. My academic training was screaming that none of this could be real. But my gut was telling me that every story the Hollow families had shared was literally true. The next day, I made my decision. While Jerry was having breakfast with his family, I packed my equipment and headed for the cave. The entrance was even colder in daylight. My breath came out in white puffs as I set up my recording equipment and checked my camera. I'd brought extra batteries and film, plus a powerful flashlight and backup bulbs. The first few feet into the cave were easy. The passage was wide enough for 2 people, with smooth walls worn by centuries of flowing water. But as I went deeper, the tunnel began to branch and twist. My flashlight beam seemed to get weaker the further I went, like the darkness was drinking up the light. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard the first voice. Teacher lady, you came to visit. It was the same little girl from the clearing. She stood in a side passage, still pale as moonlight, still smiling that too wide smile. Hello, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm here to learn about your home. We know, Greta told us you'd come. She's so excited to meet you. The girl skipped along beside me as I walked. She doesn't get many visitors. Most people are too scared. Other children began appearing in the side passages, always pale, always smiling, always watching me with those empty eyes. They chattered like normal children, but their words were wrong. Are you scared, teacher lady? Do you have children of your own? Children taste the best. Greta says smart people have more flavor, more to drink. The tunnel system was a maze. Passages led in circles, new openings appeared where none had been before. My compass spun wildly, and my watch had stopped working. I tried to map the route I'd taken, but the tunnels seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. After what felt like hours, I found myself in a large chamber filled with impossible things. Children's belongings from across decades, toys, clothes, shoes, all arranged in neat piles. But the items showed no signs of age or decay, like time had stopped the moment they'd been brought here. And in the center of the chamber stood something that had once been a woman. She was tall, maybe 9 feet, with gray-white hair that hung to the floor. Her dress was old-fashioned, European style, but it was stained with things I didn't want to identify. Her face might have been beautiful once, but now it was stretched and distorted, with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth and fingers that had grown into claws. "Welcome, my dear," she said in accented English. "I am Greta Zimmer, and you are exactly what I've been waiting for." I tried to back away, but the pale children had surrounded me. Up close, I could see they weren't really children anymore. Their skin was translucent, showing dark veins underneath. Their eyes were completely colorless, and when they breathed, no mist came out despite the cold. "You want to understand," Greta said, moving closer with each word. "You want to document and study and explain. But some hungers cannot be explained. They can only be fed." She told me her story as the empty children held me still, how she'd watched her babies starve during that first terrible winter, how she'd prayed to God and received no answer, how she'd finally prayed to something else, something that listened to desperate mothers and offered terrible solutions. "I was the first," she said, "but not the last. All through these mountains, there are mothers like me, mothers who chose hunger over loss, who chose to become monsters rather than watch their children die." She explained how it worked. The children were her extensions, empty vessels she filled with just enough stolen life to function. They went out during the dark moon to bring back fresh victims, preferably children, but adults would do when young ones were protected. And you, my dear academic, will do beautifully. Educated people always have so much life in them, so much curiosity and intelligence to savor. I felt something then, a pulling sensation, like energy being drained from my body. My vision blurred, my knees went weak. Looking down at my hands, I saw my skin beginning to wrinkle and my hair starting to gray. That's when Jerry arrived. He burst into the chamber with his shotgun blazing, silver bullets tearing through the empty children like tissue paper. They screamed and dissolved, their stolen life essence returning to whatever dark place it had come from. "Get away from her," Jerry shouted at Greta. The creature that had once been a mother laughed. "Jeremiah Winters, you've brought me so many meals over the years. Your own son was particularly sweet." Jerry went white. "That wasn't my choice." "No? Then why are you here now with another offering?" I realized the horrible truth. Jerry hadn't come to save me. He'd brought me here on purpose, just like he'd probably brought others before me. The guilt on his face confirmed everything. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he whispered. "But she takes our children if we don't give her outsiders. And I can't lose another one." Greta smiled, showing all those needle teeth. "Such a good servant. But you should have told me she was a folklore expert. Someone who might actually understand the protective symbols." She gestured to the walls of the chamber. They were covered with carved symbols, Germanic protective runes and crosses, but most had been deliberately scratched out and defaced. Most, but not all. Behind Greta's throne of children's bones, I spotted a symbol that was still intact. A complex knotwork pattern that I recognized from my folklore studies. A binding rune designed to trap malevolent spirits. If I could reach it, if I could activate it somehow. "Jerry," I said quietly, "do you still have those silver bullets?" He nodded, not understanding. "I need you to shoot that symbol behind her, the one that's still whole." "What will that do?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." I looked at him steadily. "But if we don't try, your son died for nothing. And every child she takes after this will be your fault." Jerry looked at his empty shotgun, then at Greta, then at me. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't do it. Then his jaw hardened. "For Tommy," he whispered, and fired. The silver bullet struck the binding rune with a sound like a bell tolling. The carved symbol flared with white light, and suddenly the whole chamber was filled with screaming. Greta Zimmer shrieked as chains of light wrapped around her, pulling her back toward the carved stone. The empty children collapsed like puppets with cut strings, and the cave itself began to shake, dust and rocks falling from the ceiling. "What did you do?" Greta snarled, fighting against the glowing bonds. "What your neighbors tried to do 130 years ago," I said, understanding flooding through me. "They knew what you'd become. They carved those protection symbols to contain you. But you've been scratching them out, one by one, breaking free, little by little." The binding rune was working, but I could see it wasn't strong enough. Not after being weakened by more than a century of neglect. Greta was already starting to break free, her claws tearing at the light chains. "Jerry, I need you to help me," I said. "How?" Your grandmother's silver. It's not just bullets, is it? She made other things. Jerry's hand went to his throat, where I now noticed a thin silver chain. My grandfather's cross. She blessed it with the old words. Give it to me. He pulled the chain over his head. The cross was small but heavy, carved with symbols that matched the ones on the cave walls. As soon as it touched my palm, I felt warmth spread up my arm. Greta noticed too. No, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. I understand enough. I approached the binding rune, holding the silver cross. You made a deal, but deals can be broken. Bindings can be reinforced. And monsters can be contained. I pressed the cross against the carved stone. The moment metal touched rock, the entire chamber exploded with light. Greta's screams became something inhuman, a sound like wind through graveyards and mothers crying for lost children. But the light was also revealing things I hadn't seen before. The chamber was much larger than I'd realized, filled with bones that weren't just from children, adult skeletons, still wearing the tattered remains of clothing from different decades. And carved into the walls, barely visible beneath centuries of grime, were more protective symbols. Jerry, look around you. Do you see the other carvings? He squinted in the blazing light. There's dozens of them, all along the walls. Your ancestors didn't just try to bind her. They built this entire chamber as a prison, but she's been breaking out one symbol at a time. I understood now what needed to be done. But it would cost everything. The binding isn't strong enough because it's incomplete, I said. Someone has to power it. Someone has to stay and make sure she never breaks free again. Jerry's face went pale. Eleanor, no. You have a family to protect, children who need their grandfather. I looked at him steadily. I'm already dead, Jerry. The moment you brought me here, the moment I chose to go into this cave. But maybe my death can mean something. Greta had partially broken free of the light chains. She was reaching for me with those terrible claws, her face twisted with rage and hunger. You cannot contain what you do not understand, she shrieked. Maybe not, I said, but I can try. I grabbed the silver cross with both hands and pressed it deeper into the binding rune. Pain shot through my body as the metal burned my palms, but I held on. Around the chamber, other symbols began to glow as the binding network activated. Jerry, get out of here, now. I'm not leaving you. Yes, you are, because if you don't, she wins. She'll break free, and your family will be the first ones she comes for. I looked at him through the blazing light, and because someone needs to remember what really happened here, Jerry hesitated for one more moment. Then he turned and ran for the tunnel. Greta made one last desperate lunge at me, claws extended. But the binding runes were fully active now, chains of light wrapping around her like a web. She crashed against an invisible barrier just inches from my face. This won't hold forever, she snarled. Others will come, other researchers, other curious fools. And when they do, they'll find warnings, I said. Real warnings. Not just folklore and old stories, but documented evidence. Scientific proof of what you are and how you can be contained. The light was getting brighter. I could feel my life force being drawn into the binding rune, my energy becoming part of the prison that held Greta Zimmer. My hair was completely white now, my skin aging rapidly as years drained away in minutes. But I also felt something else. Peace. For the first time since my divorce, since my colleagues had dismissed my work, since I'd started this doomed research trip, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. You think you've won, Greta said, but her voice was weaker now. The light chains were pulling her back into the deepest part of the chamber, back toward whatever dark place she'd been bound before. I think I've bought time, I said. Time for the people of Hendricks Hollow to live without fear. Time for children to grow up safe, and time for someone else to find a better solution. The binding rune pulsed one final time, and then the chamber went dark. Greta's screams cut off abruptly. The only sound was my own labored breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the tunnels. I was alone in the darkness, but I wasn't afraid. The binding was complete, powered by my life force and held in place by silver and faith and the desperate love of a community trying to protect its children. I had maybe an hour before the drain killed me, maybe less, but it was enough time to make one last recording. This is Dr. Eleanor Hartwell. I spoke into my tape recorder. If someone finds this, know that everything I've documented is real. Greta Zimmer is contained but not destroyed. The binding will hold as long as the silver cross remains in contact with the carved rune. Do not remove it. Do not try to study her. Just leave her alone and warn others away. I paused, listening to the silence. And tell Jerry Winters that I forgive him. Tell him that sometimes good people have to make terrible choices. Tell him to teach his grandchildren about the real dangers in these mountains, because knowledge is the only protection that lasts. The recorder clicked off. I closed my eyes and waited for the end, knowing that my death had meaning, knowing that somewhere above me, the children of Hendricks Hollow could sleep safely. At least for now. Jerry found my body 3 days later. When he finally worked up the courage to return to the cave, I was sitting with my back against the binding rune, the silver cross still clutched in my hands. My hair was white as snow, my face aged to that of a woman twice my actual years. But I was smiling. The chamber was silent. Greta Zimmer was gone, not destroyed, but bound so deeply that even Jerry's supernatural senses couldn't detect her presence. The empty children had crumbled to dust, their stolen lives finally released to whatever rest awaited them. Jerry carried my body out of the cave and back to Hendricks Hollow. The community buried me in their small cemetery, with a headstone that read simply, Eleanor Hartwell, teacher and protector. But that wasn't the end of my story. Jerry kept his promise. He told his family what had really happened, made sure they understood the price that had been paid for their safety. More importantly, he began teaching the younger generation about the real dangers in the mountains, not as folklore or superstition, but as documented fact. He also found a way to access my research notes and recordings. With help from a sympathetic academic at West Virginia University, Jerry published my findings, carefully edited to look like anthropological research rather than supernatural encounters. To scholars, it appeared to be a fascinating study of how isolated communities used folklore to process historical trauma. But to those who knew what to look for, it was a warning system. Other researchers began reaching out to Jerry, folklorists and anthropologists who had encountered similar stories in other mountain communities. They shared information, compared notes, and slowly built a network of people who understood what was really hidden in the folklore of Appalachia. Because Greta Zimmer wasn't unique. Throughout the mountains, there were other first mothers, women driven to desperation who had made similar deals with hungry darkness. Most were contained by their communities, bound by silver and faith and protective symbols, but some were still active, still feeding. The network grew quietly, carefully. They called themselves the Documentation Project, and they shared information through academic papers and folklore journals. To outsiders, it looked like scholarly research. To insiders, it was a survival guide. Jerry lived another 15 years after my death. Long enough to see his grandchildren grow up safe, long enough to train the next generation of protectors. When he passed in 1988, the binding rune was still holding strong. The silver cross had become permanently fused to the stone, creating a seal that his descendants continued to monitor and maintain. But in 2012, something changed. Dr. Sarah Chen was a graduate student at Georgetown University, working on her PhD in Appalachian folklore. She was particularly interested in supernatural narratives and their relationship to historical trauma. Her research led her to my old papers, and from there to the Documentation Project. Sarah was smart, dedicated, and absolutely convinced that she could find rational explanations for the supernatural elements in mountain folklore. She'd read my published research and found it fascinating, but she was certain I'd been mistaken about the literal truth of the legends. That's when she called Jerry's grandson, Michael Winters. Mr. Winters, I'm planning a research trip to Hendricks Hollow. I'd like to follow up on Dr. Hartwell's work, maybe find some new angles on the hunger spirit legends. Michael, who was 35 and had been taught from childhood about the real dangers in the forest, felt a chill run down his spine. Miss Chen, I need you to listen very carefully, he said. Those stories Dr. Hartwell documented, they're not legends, they're not folklore, and they're not safe to investigate. Mr. Winters, I understand your family's connection to these traditions, but I'm approaching this from a scientific perspective. I have equipment that Dr. Hartwell didn't have access to. Modern recording technology, digital cameras, thermal imaging. Technology won't protect you from something that drinks life itself. Sir, with respect, I think you're too close to the material. Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what's needed to find the truth. Michael closed his eyes. His grandfather had warned him this day would come. The binding wouldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would be curious enough and stubborn enough to go looking for answers. And when that happened, Miss Chen, if you're determined to come here, there are conditions. You follow my rules exactly, you don't go anywhere without me, and you absolutely do not enter the cave system under any circumstances. What cave system? Michael realized his mistake immediately. I had never mentioned the caves in my published research. That information had been deliberately omitted to keep other researchers away. Mr. Winters, what cave system? And Michael understood, with the terrible clarity his grandfather had warned him about, that the cycle was starting again. Someone else was coming to Hendricks Hollow. Someone else who didn't believe in monsters until they met one. Someone else who might disturb a binding that had held strong for 40 years. In the darkness beneath the mountains, something that had once been a mother stirred in her ancient prison. The silver was still strong, the runes still glowing faintly, but bindings could weaken, curiosity could overcome caution, and hunger, true hunger, was patient. It could wait a little longer. After all, fresh meat was coming to visit. My name is Samuel Ridge, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a park ranger here in the Great Smoky Mountains for 5 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, you name it. But what happened in October of 1981 changed everything I believed about this place. I grew up in Gatlinburg, back when it was still a small mountain town. My family had been here for generations before the government turned our home into a national park. They moved our family cemetery when they built the visitor center, but my grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days. She'd talk about mountain spirits and angry ghosts, but I figured those were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. The morning it all started, I was partnered with Patty Monroe, a Cherokee ranger who'd been working these mountains longer than anyone. She was tough as nails and knew every trail like the back of her hand. What I didn't know then was that she could see things the rest of us couldn't. We got a missing family, Chief Williams told us that Tuesday morning. The Hendersons from Ohio, parents and 2 little kids. They were supposed to check in yesterday, but nobody's heard from them. Patty studied the trail map. They took the Cataract Falls route, she said, tapping the paper with her finger. That's old Cherokee hunting ground up there. So? I asked. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Just saying, that land has a long memory. I grabbed my pack and checked my gear. Radio, GPS, first aid kit, emergency supplies, standard search and rescue stuff. Patty packed her gear too, but I noticed she added some things that weren't in any ranger manual. Small stones, dried plants, a pouch of tobacco. What's all that for? I asked. Insurance, she said. The weather was wrong from the start. October in the Smokies is usually warm and beautiful, perfect for families wanting to see the fall colors. But that morning, thick clouds hung low over the peaks, and the air felt heavy and cold. By the time we reached the trailhead, snow was starting to fall. This is crazy, I said. It's barely autumn. Patty looked up at the dark sky. Mountains angry about something. The Henderson family had signed in at the ranger station 3 days before. David and Lisa Henderson, ages 34 and 31, with their kids Emily, 8, and David Jr., 6. They looked happy in the photo on their permits, typical family vacation stuff. The kids were wearing bright red jackets that should have made them easy to spot. We followed their trail up toward Cataract Falls. The snow was getting heavier, which was actually good news for us. Fresh snow meant we could see tracks clearly. What we found, though, didn't make any sense. Look at this, Patty called out. Their campsite was there, all right. Tents still set up, sleeping bags laid out, even a pot of soup sitting on their camp stove. But here's the weird part. The soup was still warm. Not hot, but warm, like they'd just walked away from lunch. They've been gone for 3 days, I said, checking my watch. How is this soup still warm? Patty knelt down and touched the pot. It's not right, she whispered. I walked around the campsite looking for clues. No signs of a struggle. No bear tracks or torn fabric. Their backpacks were still there, food neatly stored. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. Sam, Patty called, come, look at these tracks. The footprints led away from the campsite toward the deep woods. 4 sets, like you'd expect from a family. But as we followed them, something strange happened. The tracks started changing. First, they looked normal, hiking boot prints in the snow. Then they looked like bare feet. Then the prints got longer and thinner, with weird spaces between the toes. "What kind of animal makes tracks like this?" I asked. Patty was quiet for a long moment. "Not an animal," she said finally. "The deeper we went into the woods, the colder it got. Not normal cold, but the kind that gets into your bones and stays there." My radio started acting up too, crackling with static every few minutes. "Base, this is Ranger Ridge," I said into the handset. "We're following tracks about 2 miles up the Cataract Trail. Nothing but static." "These radios are supposed to work anywhere in the park," I told Patty. She was studying the trees around us. "Look at those marks," she said, pointing to scratches on the bark. "Cherokee Trail blazes. They're warning markers." "Warning about what?" "Angry land. Places where bad things happened that never got fixed." I didn't put much stock in that kind of talk, but I had to admit something felt wrong about this part of the forest. Too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. We found the Henderson family's camera about an hour later, sitting on a fallen log like someone had placed it there on purpose. The lens wasn't broken, and it had been protected from the snow by the tree branches above. "Maybe they dropped it," I said. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The camera was sitting upright, perfectly positioned. I turned it on and started looking through the pictures. Normal vacation photos at first, the kids posing by waterfalls, family shots at scenic overlooks. But as I scrolled through them, I noticed something weird in the backgrounds. In the early photos, it was just trees and rocks. But in later pictures, there were shapes that didn't belong. Dark figures standing between the trees, too far away to make out clearly. And with each new photo, there were more of them, and they were getting closer. "Patty, look at this." She took the camera and studied the screen. Her face went pale. "We need to get out of here," she said. "What? Why?" "Those aren't shadows in the photos, Sam. Those are people. And they're not alive." Before I could argue, we heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. Children laughing and playing, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Happy, normal kid sounds that had no business being out here in this frozen wasteland. "Emily, David," I shouted. "If that's you, call out." The laughter stopped. Then we heard a little girl's voice, high and clear in the cold air. But she wasn't speaking English. She was speaking something that sounded old and musical. Cherokee, I realized. "That's Emily Henderson," I said. "Come on." Patty grabbed my arm. "Wait, 8-year-old girls from Ohio don't speak Cherokee. Maybe she learned it in school or something." "Sam, listen to what she's saying." I stopped and listened. The little girl was still talking, but now I could hear the tone of her voice. It wasn't the voice of a child at all. It was deep and serious, like an old man telling stories around a campfire. "Grandmother Spider weaves the world," Patty translated quietly. "The white faces come to steal the sacred places. The grandfathers are angry." I felt ice forming in my stomach. Kids don't talk like that. Cherokee kids from 1838 did. We found Emily 10 minutes later, sitting cross-legged in a clearing that should have been covered in snow but was somehow perfectly clean and dry. She had her back to us, humming an old tune and braiding grass into complex patterns I'd never seen before. "Emily," I called softly, "sweetheart, we're park rangers. We're here to help you." She turned around, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the whole eye, like she was looking at me from the bottom of a deep well. "The grandfathers are teaching me," she said in that old man's voice. "They show me how it was before the white faces came to steal the mountain's children." She held up her grass braiding. It was a perfect miniature Cherokee basket, the kind that took master craftsmen years to learn how to make. "Where are your parents, Emily?" "Where's your brother?" "Learning," she said. "The grandfathers have much to teach about the true history of this place." We tried to get Emily to come with us, but she wouldn't move from that clearing. Every time I reached for her, she'd look at me with those black eyes, and I'd feel like ice water was running through my veins. "We can't leave her here," I told Patty. "And we can't force her to come. Not when she's like this." "Like what, exactly?" Patty knelt down and spoke to Emily in Cherokee. The little girl answered back. but her voice kept changing, sometimes high like a child, sometimes deep like an old man, sometimes raspy like someone who'd smoked for 50 years. She says her teachers aren't finished with the lessons, Patty translated, and that her family is learning too, in different classrooms. Teachers? What teachers? Patty pointed to the trees around the clearing. I didn't see anything at first, but then my eyes started to adjust to the weird light filtering through the branches. There were people standing among the trees, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all wearing old-fashioned Cherokee clothes. They stood perfectly still, watching us with eyes that reflected the light like animal eyes in the dark. Jesus Christ, I whispered. They died on the Trail of Tears, Patty said. 1,838. Forced march to Oklahoma. Thousands died of cold, hunger, disease. The ones who didn't make it, some of them came back home. One of the Cherokee spirits stepped forward. He was an old man with white hair braided down his back, wearing traditional leather clothes. When he spoke, his voice came out of Emily's mouth. This land was stolen from us, Emily said, but in the old man's voice. Our graves were moved to make room for white man's roads. Our children were forbidden to speak our language. Now we teach the white children what they should have learned long ago. I tried to key my radio again, but it was completely dead. My GPS was spinning like a compass near a magnet. Even my watch had stopped working. Where's the rest of the Henderson family? I demanded. Emily smiled with her little girl face, but the expression was ancient and sad. Come and see, she said. She led us deeper into the woods, to a place where the trees grew in perfect circles around small clearings. In each clearing, something impossible was happening. In the first one, we found David Henderson, Sr., the father. He was sitting by a small fire, talking with a Cherokee man about his age. Both of them looked like they'd aged 20 years overnight. David's hair had gone completely white, and his face was lined and weathered like he'd spent decades outdoors. David, I called out, we're here to get you out. He looked at me with confused eyes. I'm sorry, do I know you? I've been here since, well, it must be 1,838 by now. Running Dog here has been teaching me about the old ways. The Cherokee man next to him flickered like a bad TV picture, there 1 second and gone the next. That's not possible, I said. You've only been missing 3 days. 3 days? David laughed, but it was a tired, broken sound. Son, I've been walking this trail for months. My feet have been bleeding for weeks. So many of us died along the way. Children, mostly. We couldn't keep them warm. In the second clearing, we found Lisa Henderson. She was weaving baskets with Cherokee women, singing work songs in a language she'd never learned. Her hands were rough and calloused like she'd been doing hard labor for years, and she was wearing a traditional Cherokee dress instead of her hiking clothes. Lisa, I shouted, what happened to you? She looked up at me with vacant eyes. I'm learning how to be a proper Cherokee wife, she said. Dancing Crow is teaching me to prepare food the old way, to preserve meat for the winter journey. The Cherokee woman beside her smiled, but her face was gaunt and hollow, like someone who'd starved to death. In the third clearing, we found little David Jr. He was the worst of all. The 6-year-old boy was gone, replaced by something that looked like him but moved wrong. His hair had darkened to black, and his features had shifted to look more Cherokee. He was practicing with a tiny bow and arrows, hitting targets with impossible accuracy. David, I called. He turned and spoke perfect Cherokee, words tumbling out faster than any child should be able to speak. Patty translated. He says his name is 2 Eagles now. He's learning to be a warrior. He needs to be strong for the long journey west. Journey? What journey? Journey? Emily, who had followed us, answered in her old man voice. The trail where they cried, the forced march that killed so many of our people. Your white families must learn what it was like. They must understand the price of taking sacred land. I was starting to panic. These weren't just missing people anymore. They were disappearing into something else entirely. And we were trapped in here with whatever was doing it to them. That's when I noticed the Cherokee spirits weren't just watching us anymore. They were moving closer, forming a circle around our little group. Men, women, children, all wearing the patient expressions of teachers waiting for class to begin. Patty, I whispered, I think we're next. The Cherokee spirits closed in around us, but they didn't attack. Instead, The old man who'd been speaking through Emily stepped forward and began talking directly to me in English. "Samuel Ridge," he said, and his voice was like wind through old trees. "Your family took Cherokee land for their cemetery. Your grandmother heard our voices trying to tell her the truth. That's impossible. My grandmother died when I was 12. She knew," another spirit said. This one, a woman with silver hair. "She told you stories about mountain spirits because she could hear us crying in the night. We tried to warn her about what would happen if the sacred places were forgotten. Suddenly I was somewhere else. Not standing in a clearing in 1981, but walking on a muddy road in winter. Cherokee families all around me, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Children crying from hunger and cold. Old people falling down and not getting back up. I was seeing through Cherokee eyes, feeling what they felt. The soldiers on horses shouting orders. The long line of people stretching for miles ahead and behind. The smell of sickness and death. This is what your government did to us," the old man's voice said. 16,000 Cherokee forced to walk 1,000 miles in winter. 4,000 died on the trail. Children, elders, mothers with babies. I watched a little girl about Emily's age collapse in the snow and not get up again. Her mother tried to carry her, but the soldiers wouldn't stop the march. They left her body by the side of the road. "Stop," I said. "Please, I get it. Do you?" The vision changed. Now I was standing in a Cherokee village, watching families living peacefully by the river. Children playing, women tending gardens, men hunting in the forests. Then white settlers arrived with papers and soldiers, burning houses and dragging people from their homes. "This mountain was our home for 1,000 years, the woman's spirit said. "Every tree, every stone, every stream was sacred to us. Then you took it all and called it your park." I was back in the clearing, but something had changed. I could see things differently now. The forest wasn't empty. It was full of Cherokee spirits, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They stood among the trees like they'd been waiting there for over a century. "The Henderson family must learn," the old man said. "Just as you are learning, they must understand what it means to lose everything, to be forced from sacred land, to watch their children suffer." "But they're innocent," I said. "They didn't do anything to you." "And neither did our children," the woman replied. "But they died anyway." Patty stepped forward and began speaking Cherokee. The spirits listened respectfully as she talked, occasionally nodding or asking questions. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the weight of the conversation. "What are you telling them?" I asked. "I'm explaining that times have changed," she said without stopping her Cherokee speech. "That some white people now respect Cherokee rights. That punishing innocent families won't bring justice for the Trail of Tears." The old man's spirit looked at me with eyes that held more sadness than any person should have to carry. "What would you give to free these white families?" "Anything," I said. "What do you want?" "Acknowledgement," he said. "Let the white world know what really happened here. Make sure our sacred places are protected. Teach the true history, not the pretty stories in your visitor centers. I'm just a park ranger. I can't change government policy. You can try. Will you try?" I thought about the Henderson family, trapped in some kind of supernatural time loop where they were forced to experience Cherokee suffering firsthand. I thought about little Emily with those black eyes, speaking with the voice of someone who died 150 years ago. "Yes," I said. "I'll try." The old man smiled, and suddenly he looked less like a spirit and more like someone's grandfather. "Then we will begin to release them. But the debt is not fully paid. You must serve as a bridge between our people and yours. When white visitors disrespect this land, you must teach them. When sacred sites are threatened, you must protect them. And if I fail?" His smile faded. "Then more white families will come here to learn Cherokee history the hard way." It took 3 hours to get the Henderson family out of the woods. The Cherokee spirits kept their word, but the family was changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Emily spoke Cherokee fluently now, along with English. She could weave traditional baskets and knew Cherokee songs that had been lost for generations. Little David had skills with a bow that would have impressed Olympic archers, and he kept looking for spirits that the rest of us couldn't see. The parents were the worst off. They'd aged decades in 3 days and had memories of living through the Trail of Tears that felt more real than their actual lives. David Sr. would wake up screaming about soldiers forcing them to march. Lisa couldn't sleep without first checking that her children were warm enough for a winter journey. When we got back to the ranger station, Chief Williams took one look at the family and called for medical evacuation. The official report said they'd suffered from exposure and altitude sickness, which caused hallucinations and temporary memory loss. The Cherokee spirits had given the Hendersons a choice: forget everything that happened and go home, or keep the memories and help teach others about Cherokee history. The family chose to remember. They moved to North Carolina 6 months later and started working with Cherokee cultural centers. The kids grew up to be advocates for Native American rights. David Sr. became a historian specializing in the Trail of Tears. Lisa started a nonprofit organization that protects Cherokee sacred sites from development. As for me, I kept my promise to the spirits. I stayed on as a park ranger and quietly started teaching visitors about Cherokee history. I couldn't change official park policy, but I could make sure people understood that they were walking on sacred ground. Patty became my unofficial partner in this work. She taught me to recognize the warning signs when spirits were getting angry: dead spots in the forest, electronics malfunctioning, animals avoiding certain areas. Together, we've prevented a lot of accidents over the years. The Cherokee spirits are still here. I see them sometimes when I'm alone in the deep woods, standing among the trees like patient teachers waiting for their next class. They don't bother respectful visitors, but people who litter sacred sites or carve their names in ancient trees. Well, those folks sometimes have educational experiences they never forget. My career hasn't advanced much. My superiors know I'm too interested in Indian affairs for promotion, but they can't argue with my safety record. No one has gone missing on my watch since 1981. Sometimes new rangers ask me about the stories they hear: weird things happening in the backcountry, missing time, voices speaking Cherokee in empty forests. I tell them what Chief Williams told me when I first started. These mountains have a long memory, son. Respect the land, respect its history, and it'll take care of you. But if you forget who was here first, well, the mountain has ways of teaching lessons that stick. Last month I was training a new ranger, a young guy fresh out of college who thought he knew everything about wilderness safety. We were hiking the Cataract Falls Trail when his GPS started acting up and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 10 seconds. "What's happening?" he asked, his breath coming out in white puffs. I looked around and saw them, Cherokee spirits standing among the trees, waiting patiently to see what kind of person this new ranger would turn out to be. "Time for your first real lesson about these mountains," I told him. "Let me tell you about the Cherokee concept of displaced spirits." The kid listened real carefully. Funny how quickly people start believing in Cherokee folklore when the temperature drops to freezing in the middle of July. My name is Samuel Ridge, and I've been guarding Cherokee sacred ground for over 40 years now. Some folks think that makes me crazy, but I've never lost another family to the mountain's memory, and I never will. My name is Michael Cross, and I need to tell you what happened to me on that cursed stretch of road in Virginia. I'm a Methodist preacher, or I was back in 1965 when this all started. I'd just been moved from my comfortable church in Richmond to the mountain communities along the Blue Ridge Parkway. The church officials said I needed a fresh start after some disagreements about theology, but I knew the real reason. I'd been asking too many hard questions about God's plan after my wife, Mary, and our baby son died in a car wreck 6 months earlier. The mountains were supposed to heal me, they said. Give me time to find my faith again while serving the isolated communities scattered throughout the Blue Ridge. I was assigned to 5 small churches, each one tucked away in valleys and hollows where families had lived for generations. Most Sundays, I'd have maybe 20 people in the pews, weathered faces that had seen more hardship than I could imagine. The drive between churches meant traveling the winding mountain roads almost daily. My 1962 Ford Falcon knew every curve and steep grade by heart. But there was one stretch that always made me uneasy. A section called Devil's Backbone that ran between Wintergreen and Livingston. Local folks had warned me about it from my first day. "Don't drive that road alone after dark, Reverend," old Ezra Whitmore had told me after my first service at Piney Grove Baptist. That stretch has claimed too many good people over the years. I'd smiled politely and thanked him for his concern, but inside I was frustrated. These mountain people clung to their superstitions like life preservers. Ghost stories and folklore were just ways of explaining things they didn't understand. As a man of education and faith, I believed in one supernatural force, God Almighty, and everything else could be explained by science and reason. The road itself was treacherous enough without adding ghost stories. Devil's Backbone followed an ancient ridgeline, twisting and climbing through dense forest with steep drop-offs on both sides. The pavement was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass safely. In bad weather, it became a ribbon of ice and fog that had claimed dozens of vehicles over the decades. I could understand why accidents happened there. What I couldn't understand was why the locals insisted on blaming supernatural forces. My first month serving the mountain churches, I made the drive across Devil's Backbone at least twice a week, usually in daylight. The forest was beautiful in early autumn, with leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. Sometimes I'd stop at the overlooks just to admire God's creation and try to feel something again. Since Mary and little Thomas died, I'd been going through the motions of faith without feeling any of the joy or peace I used to know. The parsonage where I lived sat between 2 of my churches, a small white house that felt too empty and quiet. Most evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of whiskey, more than 1 glass, if I'm being honest, and listen to the wind in the trees. Sometimes I'd tune my radio to distant stations, hearing voices from cities hundreds of miles away. It helped me feel less alone. But the loneliness was eating at me. During the day, I could focus on sermon preparation and pastoral visits. But when darkness fell and I was alone with my thoughts, the questions came flooding back. If God was loving and merciful, why had he taken my family? What was his plan for a broken preacher who could barely comfort himself, much less his congregation? It was on a Thursday evening in late September when I first noticed something wasn't right. I'd spent the afternoon at Mount Zion Methodist, one of my smaller congregations, visiting with Mrs. Henderson, whose husband was dying of lung cancer. By the time I finished praying with them and sharing supper, the sun was setting behind the mountains. I should have stayed the night, but I had an early meeting the next morning at another church, so I decided to make the drive home. The first part of the journey was routine. My headlights cut through the growing darkness as I wound down the mountain roads. But as I approached Devil's Backbone, something felt different. The radio, which had been playing gospel music from a Roanoke station, suddenly filled with static. I reached to adjust the dial, but before I could touch it, the static cleared and I heard voices. "Can't see the road ahead. Jesus, Mary, somebody help us." It was a man's voice, desperate and panicked, but the quality was wrong somehow. It sounded distant and hollow, like an old recording played through a broken speaker. I stopped the car at the side of the road and listened, but the voices faded back into static. Probably just picking up some radio drama from a distant station, I told myself. The mountains could do strange things to radio signals. I drove on, but the feeling of wrongness grew stronger as I climbed toward the Devil's Backbone ridgeline. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly. My breath started fogging in the car, even though the heater was running full blast. I checked the gauge. The engine was running normally, nice and warm, but inside the car felt like a cold winter morning. Then I saw the mile marker, 13.6. I'd passed it dozens of times before and never paid attention, but tonight it seemed to glow in my headlights like a gravestone. And that's when my engine started coughing. The Ford had been running perfectly all day, but now it was sputtering and jerking like it was running out of gas. I pressed the accelerator, but the engine only coughed harder. Steam started rising from under the hood. I pulled over at the widest spot I could find and turned on my emergency flashers. When I got out to check the engine, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, no wind in the trees, nothing. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muffled and strange. I lifted the hood and checked what I could see by flashlight. The radiator wasn't overheating, the belts looked fine, everything appeared normal. I was reaching for the radiator cap when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Car trouble, Reverend?" I spun around and saw a man standing about 10 feet away. He was wearing a dark coat and hat that looked old-fashioned, maybe from the 1,930 seconds or 1,940 seconds. His face was pale in the moonlight, and he had a strange, sad smile. "Yes, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Engine just started acting up. You didn't happen to see another car go by, did you?" The man tilted his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Oh, there's always cars going by on this road, Reverend. coming and going, coming and going. Most of them never make it to where they're headed. Something about his voice made my skin crawl. It had the same hollow, distant quality as the voice on the radio. I took a step back toward my car. "Well, I appreciate you stopping, but I think I can manage." "You're the new preacher, aren't you?" the man interrupted. "The one who lost his family. Terrible thing, losing the ones you love. Makes a man question everything he believes in." I hadn't told anyone in these mountains about Mary and Thomas. The church officials might have mentioned I was recently widowed, but not the details. How could this stranger know? "I should get going," I said, backing toward the driver's door. "Thank you for your concern." "Oh, you can't leave yet, Reverend. Your wife is waiting." I froze. "What did you say?" The man's smile grew wider, but there was no warmth in it. "She's been waiting right here, right at this very spot. She wants to see you again." That's when I saw her. Mary was standing on the other side of the road, wearing the blue dress she'd been buried in. She looked exactly as she had the last morning I saw her alive. Beautiful and young, with her dark hair catching the moonlight. She wasn't pale or ghostly. She looked completely real and alive. "Michael," she called, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it. "Michael, I've been waiting for you." My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't possible. Mary was dead and buried in Richmond. I'd seen her body, attended her funeral, watched them lower her coffin into the ground. But there she was, as real as the man in the old-fashioned coat, as real as the cold air filling my lungs. "Come to me, Michael," she said, extending her hand. "I've been so alone here. Please come to me." I took a step toward the road, then another. Some rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some kind of breakdown. But a larger part of me, the part that had been broken and empty for 6 months, wanted nothing more than to cross that road and take my wife in my arms again. I was halfway across the pavement when a car horn blared behind me. I spun around and saw headlights bearing down on me fast. I dove to the side of the road just as a pickup truck roared past, its horn still honking. The driver shouted something I couldn't make out as he disappeared around the curve. When I looked back across the road, Mary was gone. So was the man in the old coat. I was alone on Devil's Backbone with my broken-down car and the terrible silence of the mountains. I got back in the Ford and turned the key, not expecting anything. But the engine started immediately and ran smooth as silk, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the wheel, trying to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, brought on by grief and too much whiskey. But I knew what I'd seen. And deep down, I knew Mary would be waiting for me the next time I drove Devil's Backbone alone after dark. I tried to avoid that stretch of road for the next 2 weeks. I rearranged my schedule, stayed overnight at church members' homes, anything to keep from driving Devil's Backbone after sunset. But my duties eventually forced me back. It was a Wednesday evening when I had to make an emergency call to Hebron Baptist. Young Tommy Garrett had been in a logging accident and wasn't expected to live through the night. His mother begged me to come pray with the family, and I couldn't refuse. By the time the boy passed and I'd finished comforting the family, it was nearly midnight. This time I was ready. I'd brought a thermos of strong coffee to keep alert, and I tuned the radio to a clear station before I started driving. I told myself that whatever I'd seen before was just my grief playing tricks on me. With a clear head and good preparation, I'd drive straight through without incident. But as soon as I reached mile marker 13.6, the radio started acting up again. The music faded into static, then cleared to reveal a different voice this time. A woman sobbing. "Please, somebody help me. My babies are in the car. I can't get them out." The voice was desperate, heartbroken. I could hear the crackle of flames in the background and the sound of metal creaking. It was an emergency call from some terrible accident, but the quality was all wrong again. Like it was coming from very far away or long ago. I pulled over at the same spot where my car had broken down before. The temperature dropped immediately, and that unnatural silence fell over the forest. But this time I stayed in the car and kept the engine running. That's when I saw the other vehicles. There was a car from the 1942nd parked on the opposite shoulder, a big black sedan with rounded fenders and chrome bumpers. Steam was rising from its crumpled hood, and the driver's door hung open. Beyond it, barely visible in the moonlight, was what looked like a Model T Ford with its wheels in the air, like it had rolled over. And walking between them were the people, The man in the old coat was there again, along with a woman in a 1,920 dress, holding the hand of a small child. There were others too, a Confederate soldier missing half his face, a man in buckskins, who might have been from pioneer times, more people in clothing from different eras, all standing along the roadside like they were waiting for something. They all turned to look at my car when I pulled over, and they all had the same expression, a mixture of sadness and desperate hunger. The woman with the child started walking toward me. As she got closer, I could see that her dress was torn and bloody, like she'd been in some terrible accident. The little boy beside her had no eyes, just dark hollows where they should have been. She tapped on my passenger window with fingers that left no condensation on the cold glass. "Please," she said, and I could hear her voice clearly, even through the closed window. "Please help us. We've been waiting so long. We just want to go home." More of them started approaching the car. The Confederate soldier dragged one foot behind him, leaving a trail of something dark on the pavement. The man in buckskins had an arrow shaft protruding from his chest. They all moved with that same strange, gliding walk, like they were floating just above the ground. I threw the car into drive and hit the accelerator. The Ford leaped forward, and I heard something that might have been screaming or wind through the trees. In my rearview mirror, I could see them all standing in the road, watching me go. But the worst part was what I heard on the radio as I drove away. It was my own voice, panicked and desperate. "Can't see the road ahead. Jesus, Mary, somebody help us." It was the same voice I'd heard that first night, and I realized with cold certainty that it was me speaking, but not me yet. It was me from some future moment when I'd be the one calling for help on Devil's Backbone, when I'd be the one having an accident on that cursed stretch of road. I drove straight to Ezra Whitmore's house and pounded on his door until he answered. The old man took one look at my face and invited me in for coffee and whiskey. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he said quietly. "The ones who didn't make it off the road." I told him everything, Mary's appearance, the man in the old coat, the voices on the radio, all of it. Ezra listened without interruption, nodding occasionally like none of this surprised him. "My family's been living in these mountains for over 200 years, he said when I finished. "We've known about that section of road for generations. The Cherokee called it the Trail of Sorrows, long before any white man ever saw it. There's been death on that ridge since before recorded history." "But what are they?" I asked. "Are they really the spirits of accident victims?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "My grandmother used to say that some places are like wounds in the world, spots where the barrier between life and death gets thin. Devil's Backbone is one of those places. The spirits there, they're not exactly ghosts and they're not exactly demons. There's something caught in between. What do they want? Company," he said simply. "They've been alone on that road for so long, some of them for centuries. They want others to join them, to share in their eternal waiting." "And my wife? Was that really Mary I saw?" Ezra's expression grew sad and troubled. "Son, I don't know. But I'll tell you this. Whatever you saw wearing your wife's face, it knew exactly how to hurt you the most. That's not love. That's something else entirely. We talked until dawn, and Ezra taught me some of the old mountain ways of protection. Iron nails in my pockets, salt across the threshold, prayers that his family had passed down for generations. But as I drove home in the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting on Devil's Backbone was more powerful than folk remedies and old wives' tales. And I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. For 3 weeks after my talk with Ezra, I managed to avoid Devil's Backbone entirely. I took longer routes, stayed overnight when necessary, did everything I could to keep away from mile marker 13.6. But the pull was getting stronger. I started dreaming about Mary every night. In the dreams, she was always standing on that dark road, calling for me to join her. She looked so real, so alive, that I'd wake up expecting to find her beside me in bed. The disappointment of finding myself alone was crushing. During the day, I found myself thinking about the road constantly. I'd catch myself driving in that direction without realizing it, like my hands were steering the car on their own. Twice, I had to turn around at the last minute, fighting against a compulsion that felt stronger than my own will. My congregation started noticing changes in me. I was losing weight, drinking more, and my sermons had taken on dark themes of death and eternal separation. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that I looked haunted, and she wasn't wrong. The breaking point came on a Sunday night in late October. I'd just finished evening service at Mount Calvary Baptist when one of the church members, Sarah Collins, asked me to drive her home. Her husband was out of town, and their car was in the shop. I couldn't refuse without seeming rude, but her house was on the other side of Devil's Backbone. I told myself it would be different with another person in the car. Whatever was waiting on that road seemed to prefer solitary travelers. Sarah chatted pleasantly as we drove, talking about her grandchildren and the church's upcoming harvest festival. Her presence was comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt almost normal as we approached the cursed stretch of road. But as we reached mile marker 13.6, Sarah suddenly stopped talking. I glanced over at her and felt my blood turn to ice. Sarah was gone. The passenger seat was empty, even though I could have sworn she'd been talking just seconds before. I hit the brakes and pulled over, calling her name. But when I got out to look for her, there was no sign that she'd ever been in the car. Even her purse was gone, and there was no depression in the seat where she'd been sitting. That's when I heard the laughter. It was coming from the woods on both sides of the road. Not just one voice, but many voices laughing together. The sound was cruel and mocking, like they were enjoying some terrible joke at my expense. "Did you really think you could avoid us, Reverend?" The voice belonged to the man in the old coat. He stepped out of the tree line, followed by the woman with the child, the Confederate soldier, and dozens of others. They looked more solid now, more real than before. "Where's Sarah?" I demanded. "What did you do with her?" "Sarah Collins?" The man tilted his head with that same eerie smile. "Oh, Reverend, there hasn't been anyone named Sarah Collins in these parts for over 40 years. She died in a car accident right here at mile marker 13.6 inches, 1,923. My mind reeled. That was impossible. I'd just been talking to Sarah, an elderly woman with gray hair and a kind smile. She'd mentioned her grandchildren by name, talked about events happening in the church right now. "You're lying," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I remembered something that chilled me. When Sarah had talked about the harvest festival, she'd mentioned people who'd been dead for years, spoken about them as if they were still alive. "We don't lie, Reverend," the man said. "We don't need to. The truth is so much more frightening, don't you think?" They started moving closer, surrounding me in a loose circle. Up close, I could see that none of them were completely solid. Moonlight seemed to pass through them in places, and their feet made no sound on the gravel. "What are you?" I whispered. "We're the same thing you're going to become," said the woman with the child. "The same thing everyone becomes, who stays too long on this road. We're the lost ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who couldn't find their way home." "But I'm not dead," I said. "I'm still alive." "Are you?" The Confederate soldier spoke for the first time, his voice like wind through dry leaves. "When did you last feel truly alive, Reverend? When did you last feel joy, or hope, or anything other than the cold emptiness inside you?" I couldn't answer. Since Mary and Thomas died, I'd been going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Each day was just something to endure until the next one came. "You see?" the man in the coat said. "You're already more like us than like the living. That's why you can see us, why you can hear our voices. That's why the road keeps calling you back." That's when I saw her again. Mary emerged from the shadows at the edge of the circle, still wearing that blue dress, still looking exactly as she had in life. "Michael," she said, and her voice was soft and loving. "I've been waiting for you for so long. Why won't you come to me?" Every fiber of my being wanted to go to her, to take her in my arms and never let go. But something Ezra had said came back to me. "Whatever you saw wearing your wife's face, it knew exactly how to hurt you the most." "You're not Mary," I said, though saying the words felt like tearing my heart out. The thing wearing Mary's face tilted its head, and for just a moment, its expression changed. The loving smile became something cold and predatory. "Of course I'm Mary," it said. "I'm your wife, your beloved, the one you failed to save." "No," I said, backing away. "Mary would never blame me for what happened. Mary would never try to hurt me. Wouldn't I?" The thing's voice was changing, becoming harsher, more guttural. "You were supposed to pick us up from my mother's house that day, remember? But you were too busy with your precious sermon to come get us. So we had to drive home in the storm, and we died because you weren't there." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. It was true. I had been supposed to pick them up, but I'd been working on my sermon and told Mary to drive herself. If I'd done what I was supposed to do, they'd still be alive. "You killed us, Michael," the thing said, and now its face was shifting, becoming something horrible and twisted. "You killed your own family through your selfishness and pride." I fell to my knees in the gravel, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. The thing was right. It was all my fault. Mary and Thomas were dead because of my choices. "But you can make it right," the creature said, its voice becoming gentle again. "You can join us here, be with us forever. All you have to do is step into the road when the next car comes around that curve." I could see headlights in the distance, coming fast around the bend. The thing wearing Mary's face extended its hand to me. "Come home, Michael. Come home to us." I reached for its hand, ready to end the pain and guilt and join my family in whatever dark eternity waited on Devil's Backbone. But just as my fingers were about to touch its, I heard another voice. "Michael Cross, get away from that thing." It was Ezra Whitmore, emerging from the woods with a flashlight in one hand and a Bible in the other. Behind him came a group of people from my congregations, all carrying lights and moving together in a tight group. "Don't listen to it, Reverend," called Mrs. Henderson. "That's not your wife." The thing hissed and recoiled as the group approached. In the combined light of their flashlights, I could see what it really was. Something twisted and hungry, with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. It wore Mary's face like a mask, but underneath was something that had never been human. "In the name of Jesus Christ," Ezra shouted, "I command you to release this man." The circle of spirits began to waver and fade, but the thing wearing Mary's face held on, still reaching for me. "Michael, please," it begged. "I'm really Mary. These people want to keep us apart forever. Don't let them." For a moment, I almost believed it. But then I remembered something real about my wife. The way she used to hum while doing dishes. A little tuneless melody that always made me smile. This thing might look like Mary and sound like Mary, but it would never know those small, intimate details that made her who she was. "You're not my wife," I said, standing up. "My Mary is with God, not trapped on this cursed road." The thing's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the monster underneath. It let out a shriek that seemed to shake the very air, then dissolved into mist that was blown away by a sudden wind. The other spirits were already fading, unable to maintain their forms in the presence of so many living, faithful people. Within moments, I was alone on the road with my rescuers. "How did you know to come?" I asked Ezra as he helped me to my feet. "Sarah Collins' granddaughter called me," he said. "The real Sarah Collins, who's very much alive and was worried when you never brought her grandmother home." The next morning, I drove to Sarah Collins's house to apologize for the confusion. She was understandably concerned, but forgave me when I explained I'd been feeling unwell. What I didn't tell her was that her grandmother, the real grandmother, looked nothing like the woman who'd ridden in my car the night before. That Sarah was younger, with brown hair instead of gray, and a completely different face. The entity had created an entire false memory, a phantom passenger designed to get me alone on Devil's Backbone at the right moment. If not for the faith and courage of my congregation, I would have become just another victim of that cursed road. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into studying everything I could about spiritual warfare and demonic influence. I reached out to other ministers throughout Appalachia and discovered that Devil's Backbone wasn't unique. There were dozens of similar places scattered throughout the mountains, spots where the spiritual world pressed close against the physical one. I also began working with Ezra and some of the older church members to establish regular spiritual protection for the area. We held prayer walks along Devil's Backbone, set up crosses at key points, and taught the community signs to watch for when someone might be falling under supernatural influence. The road never became completely safe, but the worst of the entity's power was broken that night. Accidents still happened there. The curves and steep drops made it naturally dangerous, but the supernatural predation stopped. My own faith was transformed by the experience. I could no longer dismiss the supernatural as mere superstition, but I also gained a deeper understanding of divine protection and the power of community. The isolation and grief that had made me vulnerable to demonic attack was healed through the love and support of people who risked their lives to save mine. I stayed in those mountain churches for another 30 years, until arthritis and age forced me to retire. During that time, I helped establish an informal network of ministers throughout Appalachia who who dealt with similar supernatural threats. We shared knowledge, supported each other, and developed practical methods for protecting our communities. Now I'm 80 years old, and I'm training my replacement, a young minister fresh from seminary who thinks he knows everything about theology but nothing about the practical realities of spiritual warfare. Yesterday I took him for a drive along Devil's Backbone in broad daylight, showing him the mile markers and explaining what to watch for. He listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He thinks I'm just a superstitious old man telling ghost stories. I hope he never has to learn the truth the way I did. But I gave him Ezra's old protection charms anyway, and I made him memorize the emergency numbers of every church member who can be counted on in a crisis. Because somewhere on those dark mountain roads, things that should not exist still wait for travelers who venture out alone and unprotected. The spiritual battle for these mountains is never really over. It just passes from one generation to the next, carried by those who understand that faith without wisdom is vulnerability, and that some roads are more dangerous than they appear. Last week, I heard that a new minister was being transferred to serve some of the more remote churches up near Shenandoah. He'll be driving those mountain roads at all hours, serving communities that most people have never heard of. I think I'll pay him a visit next month, share some coffee, and conversation about the practical realities of mountain ministry. Because if 30 years of serving these communities has taught me anything, it's that preparation and community support can mean the difference between going home safe and becoming another voice calling for help on the radio of the Devil's Backbone. The road is still out there, winding through the mountains under the dark sky, and it's still hungry. My name is Dr. Sarah Blackthorne, and I study snakes for a living. Most people think that's pretty weird, but I've always loved reptiles. There's something honest about them. They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not. In the summer of 1989, I got a grant to study timber rattlesnakes in Shenandoah National Park. These snakes were disappearing, and nobody knew why. My job was to find out what was happening to them before they were all gone. I packed my truck with GPS tracking equipment, camping gear, and snake handling tools. The drive from Virginia Tech to the park took about 2 hours through winding mountain roads. The closer I got to Shenandoah, the more excited I felt. This research could make my career. My guide was Bob Mountaineer, a park naturalist whose family had lived in these mountains for generations. Bob was in his 50s, with weathered hands and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. When we first met at the park office, he looked at my fancy equipment and shook his head. "You sure you want to go up to Old Rag Mountain?" he asked. "That area's different." "Different how?" I pulled out my maps and spread them across his desk. Old Rag was perfect for my study. Rocky outcrops where snakes like to make their dens, far from hiking trails. Bob traced the mountain outline with his finger. "My grandfather used to tell stories about that place. Said there were things up there that weren't quite natural." I laughed. "You mean like really big snakes? I bet people just see a normal rattlesnake and think it's huge because they're scared." "Maybe." Bob didn't look convinced, but my grandfather wasn't the type to make up stories. The next morning, we hiked up the mountain with my equipment. The forest felt thick and quiet, like it was holding its breath. Old Rag Mountain was beautiful in a wild way. Massive boulders scattered between tall trees, hidden caves, and rocky ledges that went on for miles. I spent the first week catching timber rattlesnakes and fitting them with tiny GPS collars. The snakes were beautiful, brown and tan patterns that helped them blend with the rocks. Each one got a number and a radio tracker so I could follow where they went. But something was wrong from the start. The snakes weren't acting normal. Timber rattlesnakes usually stay in their own territory, but mine kept moving toward the same area, a cluster of big rocks about a mile from our camp. They moved together, like they were following some kind of plan. "That's not how snakes think," I told Bob one evening as we looked at the GPS data. "They're supposed to be loners." Bob stirred the campfire with a stick. "What if they're not making the decisions?" "What do you mean? What if something else is calling them?" I rolled my eyes. "Snakes don't have pack leaders, Bob. They're not wolves." But that night, I heard something that made me wonder. It was a sound like wind through rocks, but deeper. It seemed to come from the direction where all my snakes were heading. When I played it back on my recording equipment the next morning, The sound was so low I could barely hear it. 2 weeks into the study, I found the first shed skin. It was wrapped around a boulder like a giant ribbon, and when I measured it, my hands started shaking. 12 feet long. No timber rattlesnake got that big. Ever. I called my professor at Virginia Tech. "I think I found a skin from a different species," I said. "Maybe an escaped python or something." "In Virginia mountains?" Professor Williams sounded doubtful. "Pythons couldn't survive a winter there." But I knew what I was looking at. This skin was thick and tough, nothing like the delicate shed I usually found. And there was something else. The pattern was wrong. Instead of the typical rattlesnake diamonds, this skin had markings that looked almost like symbols. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the forest seemed louder. When something big moved through the rocks above our camp, I grabbed my flashlight and went to look. Bob caught my arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "Some things are better left alone." The next morning, Bob and I hiked to the rocky area where my tagged snakes kept gathering. The GPS signals were all coming from the same spot, a circle of massive boulders that formed a natural amphitheater. When we got there, I couldn't believe what I saw. Dozens of rattlesnakes were arranged in perfect spirals around the rocks, like someone had placed them there on purpose. They weren't moving or rattling, they just sat there, waiting. "This is impossible," I whispered. "Snakes don't do this." Bob pulled out his camera, but when he tried to take a picture, the batteries died. Fresh batteries. He tried again with backup power, but the camera wouldn't work. I walked closer to the snakes, expecting them to scatter. Rattlesnakes are shy, they usually run when humans get near. But these snakes ignored me completely. They were all facing the center of the circle, toward a crack in the largest boulder. The crack was about 3 feet wide and disappeared into darkness. Cool air drifted out, carrying a strange smell, old water, and something else I couldn't identify. I knelt down and shined my flashlight inside. The tunnel went back farther than my light could reach. The walls were smooth, like something had carved them, but the marks weren't made by water or wind. They looked like scratches, really big scratches. "Sarah." Bob's voice was tight. "We should go." I looked up and saw what had spooked him. The snakes were moving. All of them, at the same time. They slithered toward us in perfect lines, not aggressive, but definitely purposeful. It was like watching a well-trained army. We backed away slowly. The snakes followed us to the edge of their circle, then stopped. They formed a line across the rocks and just watched us leave. That evening, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I drew diagrams and wrote notes, but nothing explained how wild snakes could organize themselves like that. When I called Professor Williams again, I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Are you sure you're not seeing normal behavior and interpreting it wrong?" he asked. "Sometimes when we want to find something unusual." I know what I saw. But even as I said it, I wondered if stress was making me imagine things. 3 days later, I got my answer. I was checking GPS signals when I noticed something wrong. One of my tagged snakes, a big male I'd called Romeo, was moving impossibly fast. According to the computer, he'd traveled 5 miles in 10 minutes. I grabbed my radio and called Bob. "Something's wrong with Romeo's tracker. Can you meet me at his location?" The GPS led us to a narrow valley between 2 ridges. Romeo should have been there, but all I found was his collar lying on a flat rock. The plastic was melted, like something had heated it up from the inside. How does that happen? I picked up the collar with tweezers. The metal parts were twisted into shapes that didn't make sense. Bob examined the rock where the collar had been. "Sarah, look at this." The stone surface was marked with burn patterns in the shape of a giant snake, not carved, burned right into solid rock. The pattern was so detailed I could see individual scales. "That's not possible," I said. "Nothing burns marks into granite like that. Maybe nothing natural." I was about to argue when something moved in the rocks above us. Something big, really big. I caught a glimpse of brown and tan scales, but the size was all wrong. The snake I saw was thick as my waist and longer than my truck. "Did you see that?" I grabbed Bob's arm. "See what?" But his face was pale. The thing was gone, but I could hear it moving through the rocks, a sound like leather dragging over stone. My hands shook as I packed up Romeo's destroyed collar. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds in the forest. Normal sounds, I told myself. Wind in the trees, small animals moving around, nothing unusual. Then I heard the voice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly animal either. It sounded like words, but in a language I didn't understand. The voice was deep and slow, like someone speaking underwater. It seemed to come from the rocks themselves. I unzipped my tent flap and looked outside. Bob was sitting by the dead campfire, staring toward the rocky area where we'd found the snake circle. "You hear it too?" I whispered. He nodded. "It's been calling for 3 nights now, ever since we found that burned rock." "Calling what?" Before Bob could answer, snakes started emerging from the rocks around our camp. Not my tagged rattlesnakes. These were different, bigger. Their scales seemed to glow in the moonlight, and their eyes reflected light like mirrors. The snakes formed circles around our tents, just like they had around the boulder circle. They didn't threaten us, but the message was clear. We were being watched. "Bob," I said quietly, "I think we need to leave." "Too late for that," he replied. "It knows we're here now." The next morning, Bob told me about his grandfather. "Grandpa was Monacan," Bob said as we packed our gear. "His people lived in these mountains before the park was created. They had stories about Old Rag Mountain, said it was protected by something ancient." I rolled up my sleeping bag, trying to stay focused on normal things. "Protected by what?" "They called it Uktena, the horned serpent. Said it was bigger than any natural snake, with powers that came from the earth itself." "That's just folklore, Bob. Every culture has stories about giant snakes." But even as I said it, I remembered the burned rock and the snake that was too big to be real. Bob saw the doubt in my face. "My grandfather was forced to leave when they created the park," he continued. "But before he went, he warned that disturbing the sacred places would wake things up, things that were better left sleeping." We hiked toward the truck, but when we got to where we'd parked it, the vehicle wouldn't start. The engine turned over fine, but something had torn up all the wires under the hood. The cuts were too clean for animal claws. They looked like they'd been sliced with surgical precision. "Great," I kicked a tire in frustration. "Now what?" Bob was examining the damage more closely. "Sarah, look at this." The wires hadn't just been cut, they'd been arranged in patterns. Spirals and curves that reminded me of the snake formations we'd been seeing. Someone or something had taken time to organize the destruction. "We're 20 miles from the nearest road," I said. "How do we get out of here?" "We don't," Bob replied. "Not until it lets us." That's when I really started to panic. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but all I got was static, mixed with that strange, low sound we'd been hearing at night. Something was jamming our communications. With no other choice, we hiked back to our camp. But when we got there, everything had changed. Our tents were still standing, but they'd been moved into a perfect circle around the campfire. Our equipment was arranged in meat piles, sorted by type. "We didn't leave it like this," I said. Bob nodded grimly. "It's been through our stuff." I checked my research notes and GPS data. Everything was still there, but someone had been looking at it. My notebooks were open to pages about snake behavior, and my computer screen showed a map of all the locations where I'd found unusual activity. That evening, it finally showed itself. I was trying to get the GPS working when I heard Bob gasp. I looked up and saw it sliding between the trees. A snake so massive it didn't seem real. It had to be 30 feet long and thick as a telephone pole. But the most shocking thing was its head. 2 horn-like protrusions stuck up from its skull, and between them was something that caught the firelight like a gem. Its eyes were intelligent in a way that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just a big snake. It was something that could think. The creature stopped about 50 feet from our camp and raised its head to look at us directly. When our eyes met, I felt a strange tingling in my brain, like someone was trying to talk to me without words. Asterisk. "Why have you come here?" Asterisk. The voice was in my head, speaking English, but sounding like wind through caves. "Sarah?" Bob touched my arm. "Are you okay? You look like you're in a trance." I blinked, and the mental connection broke. The giant serpent watched me for another moment, then slithered away into the rocks. But I could still feel its presence, like eyes watching from the darkness. "It talked to me," I whispered, inside my head. Bob didn't look surprised. "What did it say?" "It wanted to know why we're here." "What did you tell it?" "Nothing." I was too shocked to think. Bob stirred the fire with a stick. "My grandfather said Uktena could speak to humans when it wanted to. Said it was older than the tribes, older than the mountains themselves. That night, I dreamed of snakes. Thousands of them, all moving toward Old Rag Mountain from across Virginia. In my dream, they were answering a call that went out through the earth itself, a summons no snake could resist. I woke up to find Bob shaking me. "Sarah, you need to see this." Outside our tent, the forest floor was covered with shed snake skins. Dozens of them, all huge. They were arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at, spirals within spirals that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Where did these come from? I picked up one of the skins. It was warm to the touch and incredibly thick. "They appeared during the night," Bob said. "All of them." I examined the skin more closely. Like the first one I'd found, it was covered with markings that looked like symbols. But now I could see they weren't random patterns. They were some kind of writing. "Bob, I think these are messages." "Messages saying what?" Before I could answer, my equipment started going crazy. All the GPS units began beeping at once, and my radio crackled to life, with voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The sounds overlapped and multiplied until it became a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. In the quiet, I heard footsteps approaching our camp. Human footsteps. Bob and I looked at each other in relief. Finally, someone who could help us get out of here. But when the figure emerged from the trees, my hope turned to dread. It was an elderly Native American woman, but she moved through the forest like she belonged to it. Her eyes held the same ancient intelligence I'd seen in the giant serpent. "You need to leave," she said without introduction, "before you wake something that should stay sleeping." The woman's name was Margaret Whitefeather, and she was a Monacan tribal elder. She'd driven up from the reservation when she felt disturbances in the sacred places. "Your research is disrupting things that have been in balance for centuries," she explained as we sat around our campfire. "The Uktena is a guardian spirit. It protects these mountains from threats that are older and more dangerous than you can imagine." "You're talking about it like it's real," I said. "Like it's not just a big snake." Margaret's eyes reflected the firelight. "What makes you think there's a difference? Your science sees only the physical. But some things exist in both the physical world and the spirit world." I pulled out my notebooks and showed her the GPS data. "Look at this. All my tagged snakes are moving in patterns that don't make sense. They're abandoning their territories and gathering in specific locations. Because the Guardian is calling them," Margaret said simply. "It's preparing for something." "Preparing for what?" Before she could answer, we heard vehicles approaching through the forest, engines and shouting voices, a lot of them. Bob grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate. "Federal agents," he called back to us. "Fish and Wildlife Service. Looks like a whole research team." My heart sank. I'd filed my research reports with the Park Service, but I hadn't mentioned the unusual snake behavior. Someone must have noticed my radio silence and sent help. The team leader was Dr. James Crawford from the Smithsonian. I'd met him at conferences. He was brilliant but arrogant, the kind of scientist who thought everything could be explained and controlled. "Dr. Blackthorne," Crawford said as his team set up lights around our camp. "We came as soon as the Park Service reported your communication problems. Are you injured?" "We're fine," I said. "Just some equipment malfunctions." Crawford looked skeptical. "Our satellite data shows massive snake activity in this area, congregation patterns we've never seen before. We're here to investigate and, if necessary, relocate any dangerous species." Margaret stood up slowly. "You cannot relocate the Guardian. It belongs to these mountains." Crawford glanced at her dismissively. "Ma'am, I appreciate local folklore, but we're dealing with a potential ecological crisis. If there's an invasive species affecting native snake populations—" "It's not invasive," I interrupted. "It's been here longer than humans." Crawford stared at me. "Sarah, what exactly have you been studying up here?" Before I could answer, the sound started. That low, rumbling call we'd been hearing every night, but louder now. Much louder. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rocks, the trees, the ground itself. Crawford's team started setting up recording equipment and motion sensors. "Fascinating," he muttered, studying the readouts. "Subsonic frequencies. Probably a large mammal." His words were cut off by a sound like thunder, but instead of fading, it grew louder. The ground began to vibrate under our feet. "It's coming," Margaret whispered. The Uktena emerged from the rocks like a living mountain. In the harsh glare of the Federal team's lights, it was even more massive than I'd thought. Its scales gleamed like polished stone, and the crystal in its forehead pulsed with inner light. Crawford's team scrambled for their tranquilizer guns, but the weapons wouldn't fire. Every piece of electronic equipment began sparking and smoking. The creature's presence somehow interfered with human technology. Asterisk, you bring destroyers to sacred ground. Asterisk, the voice said in my head. This time, I could tell that Bob and Margaret heard it too. Only Crawford's team seemed unaffected. Incredible, Crawford breathed, pulling out an old-fashioned camera. A previously unknown species. The evolutionary implications. The Uctena's head swung toward him, and its eyes began to glow. Crawford froze in place, the camera falling from his hands. Asterisk. Those who come to cage the Guardian will become part of the mountain. Asterisk. No. I stepped between them. Dr. Crawford, you need to get your team out of here, now. Are you insane? Crawford shook off whatever hold the creature had on him. This is the discovery of the century. We're not leaving. That's when I understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me. The Uctena wasn't just a big snake. It was a force of nature, connected to the spiritual heart of the mountains. My research had disturbed that balance, and now people were going to die because of it. Margaret, I said urgently, how do we fix this? The Guardian must know that the sacred places will be protected, she replied. Someone must take responsibility. Crawford was shouting orders to his team, trying to organize a capture operation, but every time they pointed equipment at the Uctena, their devices failed. The creature's power was growing stronger. I made a decision that changed everything. I'll do it, I said to Margaret. I'll protect the sacred sites, but you have to help me get these people out of here safely. Margaret nodded. The Guardian will accept your pledge if you mean it truly. But you cannot continue your research. Science that treats sacred beings as specimens violates the covenant. I looked at my equipment, my notes, my career's work. Then I looked at the Uctena, whose ancient eyes held the wisdom of millennia. I understand. I walked toward the giant serpent, my hands empty and open. I caused this, I said aloud. I'm sorry. I'll make it right. The creature lowered its massive head until we were eye to eye. When it spoke this time, everyone could hear it, a voice like wind through stone. You offer to become Guardian yourself? Yes. Then prove your commitment. Send the destroyers away. I turned to Crawford and his team. You need to leave, all of you, now. We're not abandoning a research opportunity like this, Crawford protested. The Uctena raised its head and let out a sound that shook rocks loose from the mountainside. All around us, snakes began emerging from hiding, hundreds of them, moving in perfect coordination. Crawford's team found themselves surrounded by a living wall of serpents. Okay, Crawford raised his hands. We're leaving. But as his team packed their equipment, I could see the calculation in Crawford's eyes. He would be back with more people and better weapons. The Uctena seemed to sense this too. The covenant cannot be broken again, asterisk it said. Asterisk. Those who return to exploit sacred ground will not leave. Margaret placed her hand on my shoulder. The Guardian is offering you a choice, Dr. Blackthorne. Accept responsibility for protecting these mountains, or it will protect them itself. Permanently. I understood. If I didn't take on the role of protector, the Uctena would make sure no one could ever disturb this place again. That would mean killing Crawford and his team, and anyone else who came here with the wrong intentions. What do I have to do? Margaret began to speak in her native language, words that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. The Uctena responded in the same tongue, and I felt power flowing between them, ancient agreements being renewed. You will be adopted into our tribe, Margaret explained. You will learn the old ways of living with the land instead of studying it, and you will use your scientific credentials to keep others away from sacred sites. I looked at my research equipment one last time. 20 years of education, a promising career, everything I'd worked for. But as I watched Crawford's team retreat into the forest, I knew what I had to choose. I accept. The ceremony happened at dawn. Margaret spoke words in Monacan while the Uctena coiled around the circle of stones where I'd first found the congregating snakes. I felt something fundamental change inside me, a connection to the land that went deeper than any scientific understanding. When it was over, the giant serpent approached me one last time. It touched its forehead to mine, and for a moment, I saw the world through its ancient eyes. The mountains were alive, part of a vast network of power and consciousness that humans had forgotten. The Uktena was just one guardian among many, protecting places too sacred for modern exploitation. "You understand now," it said. "I understand." The creature slithered back into the rocks and vanished. But I knew it was still there, watching and waiting. Bob helped me destroy my research data and equipment. We told the Park Service that equipment failures had made the study impossible to complete. My published report recommended the area be designated as critical habitat for endangered species. Technically true, though not in the way anyone expected. Crawford tried to organize return expeditions, but bureaucratic delays kept interfering. Documents got lost, permits were denied, funding was mysteriously redirected. I had learned that the Uktena's influence extended beyond the mountains themselves. 6 months later, I was living in a cabin near the Monacan Reservation, learning traditional ecological knowledge from Margaret and other tribal elders. I still studied snakes, but now I approached them as relatives rather than subjects. The timber rattlesnake population in the area was thriving under spiritual protection that worked better than any conservation program. Sometimes hikers reported seeing unusually large snakes in the Old Rag Mountain area, but the sightings were always dismissed as exaggeration. Bob, now serving as tribal liaison for the Park Service, made sure those reports were filed away and forgotten. My daughter came to visit last summer. She was amazed by how much I'd changed, calmer, more connected to the natural world. I taught her some of what Margaret had taught me: how to move through the forest without disturbing its rhythms, how to listen to the land itself. "Do you miss your old job?" she asked one evening as we watched fireflies dance around our cabin. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I learned something more important than any research could have taught me." "What's that?" "Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess unless you're prepared to become its guardian." Last week, another scientist contacted me about studying snake populations in Shenandoah. I politely suggested he focus his research elsewhere. When he insisted that Old Rag Mountain would be perfect for his study, I told him the area was protected by forces he wouldn't want to encounter. He laughed, of course. They always do. But I've learned to listen for the sounds in the rocks at night, the ancient voice that calls to those who know how to hear it. The Uktena is still there, still watching. And as long as I keep faith with the Old Covenant, it will remain a guardian rather than a destroyer. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the mountains. Some guardians should never be awakened. And sometimes, the most important scientific discovery is knowing when to stop looking for answers. The mountains keep their mysteries well. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm about to tell you something that'll sound crazy, but I swear on my daddy's grave, every word of it's true. It was 1972, and I was running shine up in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, 28 years old, with calloused hands and a family name that meant something in these mountains. My granddaddy started our operation back in 1923, and my daddy kept it going until the feds killed him in a raid when I was just 14. Now it was my turn. Most folks don't understand moonshining. They think we're just criminals trying to make easy money. But for families like mine, it's culture. It's survival. There ain't many jobs in these mountains, and what jobs there are don't pay enough to feed a family. My wife Betty and our 2 little ones, Sarah, 6, and Tommy, 4, they needed food on the table and shoes on their feet. Our still was hidden deep in a hollow, about 8 miles from the nearest road. You couldn't drive there, had to walk mountain trails that would break your ankle if you didn't know where to step. Dense forest covered everything, and fresh spring water bubbled up from the ground like God put it there just for making shine. I'd been working that still for 3 years, and I was proud of what we made. Morrison Moonshine had a reputation, clear as mountain water, smooth as silk, and strong enough to knock a mule on its ass. We used local corn and my granddaddy's recipe, and folks would drive from 3 counties over just to get a jar. But lately, things had been getting harder. The federal boys, ATF agents, were cracking down on mountain operations. They had helicopters now, fancy equipment that could spot us still from the air. Several families I knew had been arrested or scared out of business. The Hendersons shut down last month after agents found their operation. The Crawfords lost everything when the feds seized their land. Then there was Ezra Blackwood. That son of a bitch had been moving into Morrison territory, trying to set up his own operation in hollows that had been ours for 50 years. Ezra didn't understand the old ways, the agreements between families about who worked where. He just saw opportunity and took it. "You're asking for trouble, Jake," my wife Betty told me one evening as I got ready to head up the mountain. "Granny Morrison says there's more than just federal agents to worry about in that hollow." Granny Morrison was my daddy's mother, pushing 90 but sharp as a tack. She knew every old story, every piece of mountain folklore you could imagine. According to her, our hollow was protected by something she called hollow spirits, Cherokee ghosts or some such nonsense. "Granny's stories are useful," I said, checking my lantern and supplies. "They keep curious folks away from our business. But that's all they are, stories." Betty shook her head. "Your granddaddy believed them stories. Said they're the reason Morrison Shine is the best in these mountains." I kissed her goodbye and headed into the forest. The October night was cold, and fog hung between the trees like wet cotton. My boots knew every root and rock on that trail. I could walk it blindfolded. Owls called from the darkness, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled. When I reached the still, something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, but changed. The copper tubing that had been dented from last week's work was now perfectly smooth. The wooden mash barrels looked cleaner than I'd left them, and the fire under the main pot was burning steady, even though I was sure I'd banked it before leaving 2 days ago. I checked the mash. It should have been ready for distilling tomorrow, but it looked perfect tonight, bubbling just right, smelling sweet and strong. The whole operation seemed to be running better than it ever had. "Well, I'll be damned," I muttered, scratching my head. That's when I heard it. Soft singing, coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing words I couldn't make out. The melody was sad and beautiful, like nothing I'd ever heard before. I grabbed my lantern and followed the sound, but it faded as I moved. Just wind in the trees, I told myself. Mountain acoustics playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something had changed in that hollow. Something that would turn my world upside down. The next few weeks were the best I'd ever had making Shine. My still produced twice the normal output without me adding extra corn or sugar. The alcohol came out cleaner and stronger than anything I'd made before. So pure, it was almost like drinking liquid fire. Word spread fast. Customers were offering double my usual price, saying Morrison Shine had gotten even better than before. Money was flowing in like I'd never seen. But other things were happening too. Federal agents had tried twice to find our operation, and both times they'd given up. I heard from contacts in town that helicopter crews got confused flying over our hollow, their instruments going haywire. Ground teams would get lost on trails they'd walked before, ending up miles from where they meant to be. It's like that whole area just doesn't want to be found. One agent complained to Sheriff Barnes, who told me about it later with a grin. I should have been celebrating, but I was getting nervous. Nothing's that good without a cost. Then Ezra Blackwood made his move. I was checking the mash one morning when I heard voices coming up the trail. 4 men, moving loud and careless through the forest. Ezra's voice carried over the others, rough and mean, like gravel in a coffee can. "This is prime territory," he was saying. "Morrison's been hogging it too long. Time for a change." I grabbed my shotgun from where I kept it hidden and waited behind a big oak tree. Ezra appeared first, a tall, thin man with greasy black hair and dead eyes. 3 others followed, brothers from over in Silva who'd do anything for money. "Well, would you look at this setup," Ezra said, walking around my still like he owned it. "Real nice operation, Jake. Shame you're gonna have to find somewhere else to run it." I stepped out from behind the tree, shotgun ready. "This is Morrison land, Ezra. Has been for 50 years. You got no business here." Ezra laughed. "Land don't belong to nobody, Jake, especially not illegal operations. I'm thinking this hollow suits me just fine." His men spread out, hands moving toward the guns on their belts. I had 2 shells in my shotgun, and there were 4 of them. Not good odds. "You boys might want to think this through," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lot of accidents can happen in these mountains. Folks get lost, fall down cliffs, eaten by bears. That's when things got strange." The temperature dropped, like someone opened a freezer door. Our breath started showing in white puffs. Even though it was a warm October morning, the birds went quiet, completely silent, like someone had thrown a switch. One of Ezra's men looked around nervous. "Boss, something ain't right here." Ezra spit on the ground. "Just mountain weather. Don't go soft on me now." But I could feel it too. A presence, watching us from the trees. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin crawled like ants were walking on it. Then the mist started rising from the ground, thick, white fog that hadn't been there seconds before. It swirled around our feet, then our waists, then our chests, until we could barely see each other. "What the hell?" one of Ezra's men whispered. In the mist, shapes moved. Not quite human, not quite anything else. Tall figures drifting between the trees, there 1 second and gone the next. And that singing started again, the same sad, beautiful voice I'd heard before, but now there were others joining in, a whole choir of voices echoing through the hollow. Ezra's men broke first. "I ain't staying for this," one of them said, backing away. "This place is cursed." "Get back here," Ezra yelled, but they were already running down the trail, crashing through the underbrush like scared deer. Ezra turned to me, his face white with anger and fear. "You think some hillbilly magic tricks are gonna scare me off? I'll be back, Morrison. And next time, I'll bring enough men to handle whatever games you're playing." He disappeared into the mist, following his men down the mountain. The fog cleared as fast as it had come, the temperature went back to normal, and the birds started singing again. But I stood there shaking, knowing I hadn't imagined what just happened. Whatever was protecting this hollow, it wasn't just stories anymore. That night, I told Betty everything. She listened without saying a word, then went to get Granny Morrison. "Told you," Granny said when I finished. She was sitting in her old rocking chair, knitting needles clicking away. "Cherokee spirit's been protecting this hollow for 50 years. Your granddaddy made a pact with them back in 23. "What kind of pact?" I asked. Granny set down her knitting and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. The kind that keeps federal agents lost and rival moonshiners scared, but the kind that expects something in return. Like what? Respect, offerings, remembering whose land this really was before white folks took it. I laughed, but it came out shaky. "Granny, you can't seriously believe." "Boy," she interrupted, "your granddaddy's journal is in the old trunk upstairs. You might want to read it before you decide what's serious and what ain't." That journal changed everything. Page after page of my granddaddy's careful handwriting, describing things that should have been impossible. His first encounter with what he called the Cherokee spirits in 1923. The agreement they made, the offerings he left, first jar from every batch, tobacco scattered at the cardinal directions, cornmeal left at a special rock formation. They told me this hollow was sacred to their people. Granddaddy had written, said white men drove them off their land, but the spirits remained. They offered protection for my family if I showed proper respect. I thought they meant from the law, but it's more than that. They protect the very essence of what we do here. The last entry was from 1954, right before Daddy was killed. Stopped leaving the offerings, figured I didn't need spirit help anymore. Was wrong. Federal agents found the operation yesterday. Jake's daddy didn't make it out. Should have listened to the old ways. I closed the journal with trembling hands. Whether I believed in Cherokee spirits or not, something was protecting our hollow. And according to Granddaddy, I hadn't been holding up our end of the bargain. The next morning, I walked to the still with a jar of our finest shine, a pouch of tobacco, and a bag of cornmeal. If keeping my family safe meant leaving offerings for mountain spirits, then that's what I'd do. What I found there made my blood run cold. Ezra Blackwood had been busy. Someone had smashed 3 of my fermentation barrels and torn down part of the copper tubing. Mash was soaking into the ground, wasted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened to whoever did it. I found boot prints leading away from the still, but they didn't go far. About 50 feet into the woods, they just stopped. Not like the person had climbed a tree or jumped to rocks. They just ended, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. There was blood, too. Dark drops leading from the damaged still to where the tracks disappeared. And hanging from a tree branch, I found a piece of torn shirt I recognized. Blue flannel that belonged to one of Ezra's brothers. I set down my offerings where Granddaddy's journal said to put them. The rock formation was easy to find once I knew what to look for. 5 stones arranged in a perfect circle, covered with moss that looked like it had been growing there for centuries. The tobacco and cornmeal I scattered at north, south, east, and west. just like the journal described. The jar of moonshine went in the center of the stone circle. As soon as I finished, the forest went dead quiet. Not even wind in the trees. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, careful steps on ground that should have been covered with noisy leaves. I turned around and saw her. She was tall and straight, wearing clothes that looked like they came from another time. Leather dress, decorated with beads and feathers, long black hair braided with colored cord. Her skin had a strange quality to it, like I was looking at her through water. She was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and when she looked at me, I felt like she could see right through to my soul. "You are the grandson of Thomas Morrison," she said. Her voice sounded far away and close at the same time, like an echo that somehow reached me before the original sound. "Yes, ma'am," I managed to say. "Your grandfather showed respect. Your father forgot. You ignored the old ways until trouble came." She stepped closer, and the temperature dropped again. "The hollow remembers all debts." "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't know. But I'm here now, making offerings like Granddaddy did." She nodded slowly. "The spirits accept, but others come with darker purposes. The man called Blackwood brings one who works against us." "What do you mean?" "He seeks to bind this place with different magic. Conjure work from the Low Country. If he succeeds, the protection will break, and your family will have nothing." Before I could ask more questions, she was gone, just melted back into the forest like morning mist. I ran back to the still, my heart pounding. The damaged equipment was completely repaired, better than before, like it had never been broken. The wasted mash had been replaced with fresh mixture that smelled perfect. Even the blood and torn cloth were gone. But I could feel eyes watching me from the trees, not unfriendly, but alert, waiting. That evening, I told Betty and Granny everything. Granny just nodded like she'd expected it all along. "Cherokee spirits don't mess around," she said, "but they're fair. You respect them, they'll protect you. Problem is, sounds like Ezra's bringing in outside help." "What kind of outside help?" "Conjure woman, most likely. Root workers from down in South Carolina or Georgia. They know different magic, darker magic. Cherokee spirits are tied to the land, but conjure work can travel anywhere." 3 days later, Ezra proved her right. I was working late at the still when I heard them coming. More men this time. At least 6 voices. And something else that made my skin crawl. A woman's voice, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed my rifle and hid behind the same oak tree as before. Ezra appeared first, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked an old black woman carrying a bag that clinked with glass bottles. Her eyes were white with cataracts, but she moved through the dark forest like she could see perfectly. "This is the place," she said, her voice like dried leaves scraping together. "Strong spirits here, but they can be bound." She started pulling things from her bag, bones, feathers, small glass bottles filled with different colored liquids. The men spread out around the still, each one carrying what looked like military weapons. These weren't local boys looking for quick money. These were serious. "You sure about this, Mama Laveau?" Ezra asked. "Last time we tried to move on Morrison, 3 of my men disappeared." "That was before," the old woman said. "Now I'm here. Cherokee spirits are old and powerful, but they're tied to place. My spirits travel with me." She started arranging her materials in a pattern around our offering stones, chanting in that strange language. The bones she laid out in a line, the feathers she planted upright in the ground, and the bottles she opened, one by one. Each one released a different smell, some sweet, some rotten, all of them wrong. The forest started fighting back immediately. Wind rose from nowhere, whipping the trees so hard I thought they might break. The temperature dropped so fast that frost started forming on the conjure woman's materials. And the singing began again, not just one voice now, but dozens, coming from every direction at once. "Hold your positions," Ezra yelled to his men, but I could see them wavering. The Cherokee singing was getting louder, and shapes were moving in the darkness between the trees. The conjure woman kept working, pouring liquids from her bottles onto the bones and feathers. Where the liquid touched the ground, the grass died instantly. Whatever she was doing, it was working. The Cherokee singing started to fade, and the shapes in the forest retreated. "That's right," she cackled. "Old spirits, new chains. This hollow belongs to us now." That's when the real war started. The ground began to shake, not like an earthquake, but like something huge was moving underneath. trees that had stood for hundreds of years started groaning and swaying, and from somewhere deep in the earth came a sound like thunder mixed with screaming. Cherokee spirits erupted from the ground around the stone circle. Not just the woman I'd seen before, but warriors in full battle dress, their faces painted for war. They were translucent but solid at the same time, armed with tomahawks and war clubs that gleamed in the moonlight. Ezra's men opened fire, but the bullets passed right through the spirits without effect. The conjure woman threw more bottles, trying to complete whatever binding spell she was working, but Cherokee warriors were moving faster than human eyes could follow. One of Ezra's men screamed and fell, clutching his chest like he'd been stabbed, but there was no wound. Another dropped his rifle and ran into the forest, only to come stumbling back minutes later with his hair turned completely white. "Finish the binding," Ezra shouted at the conjure woman, but she was in trouble too. Cherokee spirits surrounded her, and every time she tried to pour one of her bottles, invisible hands knocked it from her grip. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Cherokee spirits and conjure magic clashing in ways that made reality bend and twist. At one point, I could have sworn I saw two different forests occupying the same space, one green and alive, the other dead and gray. Finally, the conjure woman managed to complete her spell. She poured the last bottle onto her arrangement of bones and feathers and spoke a word that made my ears ring. The Cherokee spirits froze in place, like they'd been turned to stone. "Got you now," Ezra said, walking toward the offering stones with his rifle raised. Time to clear out these hillbilly ghosts for good. But he'd made a mistake. He'd forgotten about me. I put 3 rifle shots into the conjure woman's bottle collection, shattering her remaining materials and breaking whatever spell she'd been weaving. The Cherokee spirits immediately came back to life, and this time, they weren't just fighting to defend. They were fighting to destroy. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Ezra's men didn't just disappear. They were taken apart piece by invisible hands, their screams echoing through the hollow until the silence was worse than the noise. The conjure woman tried to run, but Cherokee warriors followed her, and her voice faded into the distance until it cut off completely. Ezra himself lasted the longest, firing his rifle at spirits he couldn't hit while backing toward the trail. The last I saw of him, he was running through the forest with something dark and terrible chasing him, moving through the trees faster than any living thing should move. Then it was over. The forest went quiet, and I was alone with the Cherokee spirits. The woman in the leather dress appeared again, but now she wasn't alone. A dozen other spirits stood with her, warriors, elders, children, all of them looking at me with eyes that held centuries of pain and wisdom. "The threat to the hollow is ended," she said, "but greater threats remain. Men with badges and helicopters, they will come soon." "What do I do?" I asked. "The pact must be renewed," she said, "but this time the price is higher. Your family has Cherokee blood. Your great-grandmother was one of us, hidden among white settlers. If you accept the full protection, you accept the full responsibility." "What does that mean?" "Your family becomes guardians of this place forever. Your children learn the old ways. The hollow exists partly in our world, partly in yours. Federal agents will never find it, but you can never truly leave it." I thought about Betty and the kids, about the money we needed, about federal agents closing in on every moonshiner in the mountains. I thought about Ezra and his men, and what would have happened if the spirits hadn't been here to protect us. "I accept," I said. The Cherokee woman smiled for the first time since I'd seen her. "Then let the binding begin." What followed was the strangest night of my life. The Cherokee spirits led me deeper into the hollow than I'd ever been, to a cave hidden behind a waterfall that I would have sworn wasn't there before. Inside, the walls were covered with paintings, not the kind tourists see in museums, but living art that moved and changed as I watched. The paintings showed the history of the hollow, Cherokee families living in harmony with the land for hundreds of years, white soldiers coming with guns and chains, driving the people from their homes, and through it all, the spirits remaining, waiting for someone who would show respect for what came before. "Your great-grandmother was Yellowbird," the spirit woman told me as we stood before the paintings. "She married a white man to protect her children from removal. Your family carries Cherokee blood, which is why the spirits answered your grandfather's call." She showed me how to read the paintings, how to understand the old agreements written in symbols instead of words. The original pact was simple, protection in exchange for respect. But what I was agreeing to now was deeper, more permanent. Federal agents will come tomorrow, she said. A full raid, planned for weeks. Without spirit protection, your family would be destroyed. I felt my blood go cold. How do you know? We see all that threatens the hollow, but if you complete the binding tonight, they will find nothing. The hollow will exist in our realm as much as yours, hidden from all who don't belong. The ceremony took hours. I had to learn Cherokee words, perform rituals that felt older than human memory, and drink water from a spring that tasted like liquid starlight. With each step, I felt myself changing, not physically, but spiritually, connected to the land in ways I'd never imagined. As dawn broke, the Cherokee woman handed me a small leather pouch. For your wife and children. Cherokee medicine to help them understand their heritage. The old blood calls to them now. I made my way back to our house, my head spinning with everything that had happened. Betty was waiting for me on the porch, pale with worry. "Jake, where have you been?" Sheriff Barnes called. "Federal agents are surrounding our property. They're coming up the mountain right now." I looked down the valley and saw them, black vehicles snaking up the mountain road, helicopters circling overhead. At least 50 agents, armed and ready for war. "It's okay," I told Betty, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Get the kids and come with me. We need to get to the hollow, Jake. That's the first place they'll look. Trust me." We ran through the forest as fast as we could with 2 small children. Behind us, I could hear agents spreading out, dogs barking, radios crackling. They were closing in from all directions. When we reached the hollow, everything looked normal. My still sat in its usual spot, copper tubing gleaming in the morning sun. But as soon as my family crossed into the circle of offering stones, the world changed. The sounds of pursuit faded to nothing. The helicopters overhead became distant dots that circled without seeing. The dogs lost our scent completely. We stood in the same physical space as before, but we were also somewhere else, somewhere the federal agents couldn't reach. "My God," Betty whispered. "Jake, what did you do?" Before I could answer, the agents burst into the clearing. I watched them search the area where we stood, looking right through us like we were ghosts. Their equipment went haywire. Compasses spinning wildly, radios producing only static, dogs whimpering and refusing to track. The lead agent, a hard-faced man in a suit, kicked over one of my fermentation barrels in frustration. "Intel said there was a major operation here. Where the hell is it?" They searched for hours, finding nothing. No still, no evidence, no sign that anyone had ever made moonshine in that hollow. From their perspective, it was just empty forest. From ours, we were standing in the middle of my operation, watching them fumble around like blind men. Finally, they gave up and left. As their vehicles disappeared down the mountain, the Cherokee woman appeared beside us. "The protection holds," she said, "but remember the price. Your children must learn the old ways. Your family serves as guardians now, keepers of sacred ground." She handed Betty the leather pouch I'd forgotten about. Medicine to help them understand their heritage. They carry Cherokee blood, and it will call to them as they grow. Betty opened the pouch and breathed in the scent. Herbs and flowers I couldn't identify, but that smelled like home somehow. "What does this mean for us? For them? It means you're safe," the spirit woman said. "Federal agents will never find this hollow again. Your moonshine operation can continue without interference. But your children will grow up between 2 worlds, the white world below and the Cherokee world here. They must be taught both." Over the following weeks, everything changed. The hollow existed in what the Cherokee woman called the between space, visible to us and our customers, but hidden from law enforcement. Our moonshine developed an even stronger reputation, bringing buyers from across the southeast who claimed it had properties beyond normal alcohol. Betty learned to prepare Cherokee medicines from the herbs that grew wild in our protected hollow. The children started having dreams in a language they'd never heard but somehow understood. And I found myself changing too, understanding the land in ways my grandfather never wrote about in his journal. But the biggest change came 3 months later, when federal agents tried one more raid. This time, they brought twice as many men, specialized equipment, and a determination to find what they knew had to be there. We watched from the hollow as they set up command posts and search grids, bringing in geology experts and advanced detection equipment, But no matter how hard they looked, they found nothing. Worse, from their perspective, several agents reported equipment failures, hallucinations, and what one described as temporal displacement, losing hours of time with no memory of what had happened. The official report, which I read years later when it was declassified, listed our hollow as a geographic anomaly with unusual magnetic properties that interfered with electronic equipment. The ATF quietly designated the area as off-limits for future operations. We were safe. But safety came with responsibility I was only beginning to understand. That was 20 years ago. Sarah and Tommy are grown now, with children of their own, and they've both learned to walk between the Cherokee and white worlds, just like their mother predicted. Sarah became a teacher who specializes in Native American history, while Tommy took over the moonshine operation and learned to speak Cherokee better than most people who grew up on the reservation. Our hollow still exists in that strange between space. Federal agents occasionally wander through, but they never see anything worth investigating. To them, it's just empty forest with weird magnetic readings. To us, it's home, a place where the past and present exist side by side, where Cherokee spirits still walk among the trees, and where the finest moonshine in the Appalachian Mountains flows like water. Betty runs a clinic now, treating local people with a combination of modern medicine and Cherokee healing arts. She's become something of a legend herself. Folks come from 3 counties away when the doctors can't help them, and she has a success rate that would make Johns Hopkins jealous. Granny Morrison lived to be 96, long enough to teach her great-grandchildren the old stories and see them choose to stay guardians of the hollow. She passed quietly in her sleep 5 years ago, but sometimes I still see her spirit walking the mountain trails, keeping watch over her family. The Cherokee spirits remain active, protecting not just our operation, but the entire hollow from outside interference. They've extended their protection to other respectful moonshiner families in the region, folks who show proper respect for the land and its original inhabitants. We've created a network of spiritually protected operations throughout the mountains, all connected by ancient agreements and modern necessity. But it's not all peaceful. Every few years, someone like Ezra Blackwood shows up, thinking they can take what isn't theirs or challenge what they don't understand. The spirits deal with them in their own way, and those people are never seen again. I don't ask questions about what happens to them. Some knowledge is better left alone. The moonshine itself has become something special. Customers claim it has properties beyond normal alcohol. Some say it helps them see truth more clearly. Others that it connects them to family members who've passed on. Scientists would probably call it nonsense, but I've seen enough to know that science doesn't explain everything. My grandson, Jake Jr., is 15 now and already showing signs of the gift. He can see the Cherokee spirits without any training, speaks to animals like they understand him, and knows when strangers are approaching the hollow hours before they arrive. He's the 4th generation of Morrisons to be born into this life, and the spirits say he'll be the strongest guardian yet. Sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the forest is quiet, I think about that October morning when Ezra first tried to take our land. If I'd known then what I know now, about the price of spirit protection, about living between worlds, about raising children who belong as much to the Cherokee realm as the white one, would I have made the same choice? The answer is yes. Every time, because federal agents still patrol these mountains, and they're better equipped than ever. Other moonshining families have been destroyed, their operations shut down, their traditions lost forever. But we remain, protected by agreements older than the United States itself, making the finest whiskey in the world in a place that exists on no government map. The hollow remembers everything, every agreement, every betrayal, every act of respect or disrespect. And as long as my family honors the old ways, learns the Cherokee language, and serves as guardians of sacred ground, the spirits will ensure our survival. Betty found me yesterday reading Granddaddy's journal for the 100th time, and she asked me if I ever regret the choice I made that night. Never, I told her. But I wonder sometimes what our lives would have been like if we'd stayed in the normal world. She smiled and pointed to where our grandson was playing with Cherokee spirit children only he could see, learning games that had been old when the first Europeans reached these shores. We'd have been poorer, she said, and lonelier, and probably in federal prison. She's right, of course. The spirits gave us more than protection. They gave us purpose, heritage, and a connection to something larger than ourselves. But they also gave us responsibility that will never end. Tonight, like every night for the past 20 years, I'll walk to the offering stones and leave tobacco for the spirits who guard our hollow. I'll pour a little moonshine on the ground for my granddaddy and daddy, whose choices led to mine. And I'll listen to Cherokee songs carried on the mountain wind, reminding me that some agreements transcend death, law, and time itself. The hollow spirits are patient. They've waited 2 centuries for their land to be respected again, and they'll wait 2 centuries more if necessary. But they remember everything, and they never forget a debt. Neither do I. My name is Dr. Margaret Thornfield, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm a psychiatrist, which means I help people with problems in their minds. I work at Charleston State Hospital in West Virginia, and I've been doing this job for 15 years now. In October of 1954, my boss called me into his office with a strange request. He had a folder on his desk marked Ravens Hollow, urgent. "Maggie, we need you to take a trip up into the mountains," he said, sliding the folder across to me. "There's a small community up there having some unusual problems." I opened the folder and read the report. 23 people in a tiny mountain town were all showing the same weird symptoms. They were having nightmares, the exact same nightmares. They would walk around during the day like they were in a trance, doing things they couldn't remember later. Some of them were speaking in strange languages that nobody recognized. The strangest part? They were all afraid of the same person. An old woman named Elvira Blackthorne, who lived alone in the woods. "They think she's a witch," my boss said, shaking his head. "The local preacher wants her arrested, or worse. The state health department is worried this could turn into something violent if we don't step in." I'd seen cases like this before, or at least I thought I had. Sometimes when people live in isolated places, stress and fear can make them all sick in the same way. It's called mass hysteria. Usually it happens in schools or factories, but it could happen in a small town too. "When do I leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." "But Maggie, there's something else you should know. This place is really cut off from the world. No electricity, no telephones. You'll have to ride a horse the last 5 miles just to get there." The next morning, I packed my medical bag, my notebooks, and enough supplies for a week. The drive up into the Allegheny Mountains took 4 hours on winding dirt roads. The trees got thicker and the air got colder as I climbed higher. At the end of the road, I met Tom Bradley, a local guide with a pack horse. He was a thin man in his 60s, who looked nervous about something. "You sure you want to go up there, Doc?" he asked as he helped me load my bags onto the horse. "Folks down here have been hearing strange things coming from the hollow at night." "What kind of strange things?" "Screaming. But not human screaming, if you know what I mean." I didn't, but I climbed onto the horse anyway. Tom led me up a narrow trail that wound between tall pine trees. The path was so steep in places that I had to hold tight to keep from sliding off. After 2 hours of riding, we came to a clearing where I could see the community of Ravens Hollow spread out below us. It looked like something from 100 years ago. Maybe 20 small wooden houses clustered around a white church, with vegetable gardens and chicken coops scattered between them. Smoke rose from several chimneys, but there were no people outside. No children playing, no adults working in their gardens. The whole place felt empty and dead. "That's strange," Tom muttered. "Usually you can hear the kids playing from here." As we rode down into the village, I noticed something else odd. Every single door and window was shut tight, even though it was a warm afternoon. And on almost every door, someone had nailed up a small wooden cross. We stopped in front of the church, and Tom helped me down from the horse. "I'll be back for you in 5 days, Doc. You sure you'll be okay?" Before I could answer, the church door opened, and a tall man in black clothes walked out. He had gray hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Dr. Thornfield, I presume," he said in a deep voice. "I'm Preacher Samuel Crow. We've been expecting you." Tom quickly unloaded my bags and rode away without saying goodbye. I watched him disappear up the trail, feeling suddenly very alone. "Come inside, Doctor," Preacher Crow said. "We have much to discuss." The inside of the church was dark and cold. Preacher Crow led me to a small room behind the altar where he had set up a desk and chairs. On the desk was a thick notebook filled with handwritten pages. "This contains every incident we've recorded," he said, opening the notebook. "It started 3 months ago, right after old Silas Blackthorne died. That's when his widow Elvira began her activities." I pulled out my own notebook and pen. "Tell me about the symptoms your people are experiencing." "They have nightmares every night. The same nightmare. They see Elvira in her cottage, doing things, unholy things. But here's what troubles me most, Doctor. In these dreams, they see details of her property that they've never seen in real life." "How is that possible?" "Dreams can be very creative," I said, trying to sound calm. "Sometimes our minds make up details that feel real." Preacher Crow stared at me. "Doctor, little Sarah Mills described the exact location of a hidden root cellar behind Elvira's cottage. She's never been within a mile of that place. How did she know about it?" I wrote that down. "What else?" "During the day, they walk around like sleepwalkers. They do their chores, but they don't remember doing them. And sometimes they speak in tongues, foreign languages that sound old and strange." "Have you recorded any of this speech?" "I've written down what I could understand. Some of it sounds like Scottish or Irish, but the old kind. The kind they might have spoken hundreds of years ago." That made me pause. How would isolated mountain people know ancient Scottish dialects? "There's more," Preacher Crow continued. "Yesterday, 3 families found objects in their homes that didn't belong to them. Old things made of stone and metal, carved with symbols none of us recognize. Could someone be placing these items there as a prank?" "In locked houses, Doctor. Houses that were locked from the inside." I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing families. The stories were all similar and all disturbing. Mary Jenkins, a mother of 3, told me about waking up to find her children standing in their bedroom, all staring out the window toward the forest. "They were talking, but not to each other," she said, wringing her hands. "They were talking to someone outside, but there was nobody there. And Doctor, they were speaking in perfect Irish accents, like they'd been born in Ireland." Her 8-year-old daughter Beth sat quietly in the corner during our talk, but when I asked her about the incident, she looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than 8. "The old woman calls to us at night," she said in a voice that made my skin crawl. "She wants us to remember what we forgot." "What did you forget, Beth?" "Who we really are." That evening, Preacher Crow gave me a small cabin to stay in at the edge of the village. It had 1 room with a bed, a table, and a fireplace. No electricity, so I lit oil lamps as the sun went down. I sat at the table reviewing my notes by lamplight. Everything I'd heard could be explained by mass hysteria, but there were details that bothered me. The consistency of the dream content, the foreign languages, the mysterious objects. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something outside. At first it sounded like wind in the trees, but then I realized it was voices. Multiple voices speaking in unison, but too far away to understand the words. I blew out my lamp and went to the window. In the moonlight, I could see 7 or 8 people standing in the village square. They were all facing the same direction, toward the dark forest beyond the houses. They were speaking together in what sounded like a chant or prayer, but in a language I'd never heard before. Their voices rose and fell, in a rhythm that made something deep in my chest vibrate with fear. Then, from somewhere in the forest, another voice answered. It was a woman's voice, old and strong, speaking the same strange language. The people in the square stopped chanting and began walking toward the forest edge, moving in perfect unison like soldiers marching. I grabbed my medical bag and rushed outside, but by the time I reached the square, everyone was gone. The village was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But on the ground where they'd been standing, someone had drawn a large circle in the dirt. Inside the circle were symbols that looked ancient and purposeful, carved deep into the earth with something sharp. I was still staring at the symbols when I heard footsteps behind me. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Doctor." I spun around to see Preacher Crow walking toward me, carrying a lantern. "I heard voices," I said. "People were standing here, chanting in some foreign language." He held up his lantern and looked at the symbols in the dirt. His face went pale. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's getting stronger." The next morning, I decided I needed to meet Elvira Blackthorne myself. Preacher Crow tried to talk me out of it, but I insisted that I couldn't help these people without understanding what they were afraid of. "At least let me send someone with you," he said. "No, If she really is causing some kind of psychological influence over the community, I need to observe her behavior without outside interference. He gave me directions to her cottage, a 2-mile hike through the forest along an old hunting trail. As I walked deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The trees grew so thick overhead that even at midday, it felt like twilight. I found the cottage in a small clearing beside a stream. It was older than the houses in the village, built from logs that had turned gray with age. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and I could smell herbs drying, not unpleasant but unfamiliar. Before I could knock, the door opened. Elvira Blackthorn was a small, thin woman with white hair braided down her back. Her eyes were the palest green I'd ever seen. And when she looked at me, I felt like she could read my thoughts. "Dr. Thornfield," she said with a slight Scottish accent. "I've been expecting you. How did you know my name?" "The same way I know you're here to determine whether I'm causing harm to my neighbors." She stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. "Come in. We have much to discuss." The inside of her cottage was warm and filled with the scent of drying plants. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and the walls were lined with shelves holding jars of roots, leaves, and powders I couldn't identify. "You're an herbalist," I said. "Among other things." She poured hot tea from a kettle hanging over the fire. "My grandmother taught me the old ways before she died. Plant medicine, healing touch, reading the signs in nature. And what about the supernatural things the villagers accuse you of?" Elvira was quiet for a long moment. Then she set down her teacup and looked directly at me. "Doctor, what would you say if I told you that most of the people in Raven's Hollow are descended from Scottish families who fled to America because they were accused of witchcraft?" "I'd say that's an interesting historical fact, but it doesn't explain what's happening now, doesn't it?" She stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she pulled out an old leather book. This was my grandmother's journal. She kept records of our family history going back 200 years. She opened the book and showed me pages covered with handwritten notes and drawings. I saw family trees, birth and death records, and detailed accounts of something she called the blood calling. My family, and 7 others in this hollow, all fled Scotland in the 1822, Elvira explained. They came here to escape persecution, but they brought their gifts with them. The ability to speak with plants, to heal with touch, to see things that others cannot see. You're talking about supernatural abilities. I'm talking about natural abilities that most people have forgotten how to use. She turned to a page covered with names. For 5 generations, these gifts stayed quiet. The families lived normal lives, raised their children, tried to fit in with the modern world. But something changed? 3 months ago, when my husband died, something inside me broke open. Grief has a way of awakening things we thought were gone forever. And once my abilities returned, they began calling to the others. I stared at the book, trying to process what she was telling me. "You're saying that you're somehow activating dormant supernatural abilities in your neighbors?" "Not activating, awakening. The abilities were always there, passed down in their blood. I'm simply reminding them who they really are." As if to prove her point, she walked to a small plant on the windowsill that was brown and dying. She placed her hands around it without touching the leaves, closed her eyes, and whispered something in what sounded like Gaelic. I watched in amazement as color returned to the plant. The brown leaves turned green, new buds appeared, and within minutes it looked healthy and vibrant. "How did you do that?" "The same way your heart beats without you thinking about it," she said simply. "It's just something I can do." "But why are people afraid of you? Why do they think you're harming them?" For the first time, Elvira looked sad. "Because Preacher Crow has convinced them that any power that doesn't come from his God must come from the devil. He's terrified that if people embrace their natural gifts, they won't need his church anymore. And the nightmares? The strange behavior? When abilities awaken suddenly, after being suppressed for generations, it can be overwhelming. Like a dam bursting. The dreams are memories, ancestral memories of our people's persecution in Scotland. The strange behavior happens when past and present get confused in their minds. Can you make it stop?" "I could," she said quietly. "But that would mean suppressing their true nature forever. Doctor, these people are living half-lives, cut off from abilities that are their birthright. Is that really better than a few weeks of confusion while they adjust?" I left her cottage with more questions than answers. On the walk back to the village, I tried to apply my scientific training to what I'd seen and heard. There had to be a rational explanation for the plant healing, maybe some kind of chemical she'd applied when I wasn't looking. But as I emerged from the forest, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. All 23 affected villagers were standing in the square again. But this time they were awake, and it was broad daylight. They stood in a perfect circle, holding hands, speaking in unison in that strange language I'd heard the night before. In the center of the circle, a small whirlwind of dust and leaves spun in the air, even though there was no wind. As I watched, the whirlwind grew larger and began to take shape. For just a moment, I could swear I saw the figure of an old woman made of swirling air and debris. Then Preacher Crow came running from the church, shouting and waving his arms. "Stop this devil's work," he yelled. "Release my people from your spell." The moment he spoke, the whirlwind collapsed and the villagers broke apart, looking confused and frightened. Several of them fell to their knees, and others ran back to their houses. But as they scattered, I noticed that each person's eyes had changed. Where before they had looked tired and scared, now they seemed more alert, more alive than I'd seen since arriving in Raven's Hollow. Whatever was happening here, I was beginning to suspect that Preacher Crow's cure might be worse than Elvira's disease. That night, Preacher Crow called a town meeting in the church. Every adult in Raven's Hollow was required to attend. I sat in the back, watching as families filed in and took their seats on wooden benches. The preacher stood at the front, holding his Bible, his face grim with determination. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing off the walls, "we have tolerated evil in our midst for too long. Tonight, we must decide what to do about the witch who has poisoned our community." Several people nodded and muttered agreement, but I noticed that others looked uncomfortable with his words. "I propose that we hold a trial," Preacher Crow continued. "Let Elvira Blackthorn come before us and answer for her crimes. Let her explain how she has corrupted our children and filled our nights with demonic visions." "What if she refuses to come?" asked Tom Bradley, the guide who had brought me to the village. "Then we go to her," the preacher replied grimly. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly. She was one of the few villagers who hadn't shown any symptoms of the strange behavior. "Samuel," she said, "my family has lived in this hollow for 4 generations. I remember stories my grandmother told about the old ways before your church came here. Maybe what's happening isn't evil. Maybe it's just forgotten." "There are no old ways, Helen," Preacher Crow snapped. "There is only God's way and the devil's way, and I know which one that woman in the woods follows." "But what if we're wrong?" Mrs. Patterson insisted. "What if we're about to persecute an innocent woman the same way our ancestors were persecuted in Scotland?" A murmur ran through the crowd. I realized that some of these people knew their family histories better than the preacher wanted them to. "I'll go get Elvira," said a voice from the middle of the church. Everyone turned to see young Beth Jenkins, the 8-year-old girl I'd interviewed earlier, standing on her bench. But something about her was different. She stood straighter, spoke with more confidence, and her eyes held a wisdom that didn't belong in a child's face. "Beth, sit down," her mother Mary said nervously. "It's time for the truth," Beth replied, but her voice sounded older, with a faint Scottish accent. "Too many secrets. Too much fear. The old woman shouldn't face this alone. Too many secrets that..." Before anyone could stop her, Beth walked out of the church. Her mother started to follow, but Preacher Crow grabbed her arm. "Let her go," he said. "If the witch wants to use a child as her messenger, then let God judge them both." We waited in tense silence for nearly an hour. Then the church doors opened again, and Elvira Blackthorn walked in. She wasn't alone. Behind her came not just Beth, but 7 other children from the village, all walking with the same strange confidence, all carrying themselves like adults in small bodies. "You wanted to see me," Elvira said simply. "Here I am." Preacher Crow stood behind his pulpit like a judge. "Elvira Blackthorn, you stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of corrupting the minds of our people, and of consorting with demonic forces. How do you answer these charges?" "I answer that you don't understand what you're trying to destroy," Elvira replied calmly. "Then explain it to us," Mrs. Patterson called out. "Help us understand." Elvira looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors. Some showed fear, others curiosity, and a few showed something that might have been hope. Very well, she said. But first, you should know that I'm not the only one with abilities in this room. She gestured to the children standing behind her. These young ones carry the blood of our Scottish ancestors. They have gifts that your preacher calls evil, but which are as natural as breathing. Prove it, Preacher Crow demanded. Little Beth stepped forward. She walked to the altar where a vase of wilted flowers sat beside the Bible. The flowers had been dying for days in the cold church. Beth placed her small hands on either side of the vase and began to whisper in Gaelic. As she spoke, the wilted petals began to lift and straighten. Color returned to the stems and leaves. Within minutes, the flowers looked as fresh as if they'd just been picked. The congregation gasped, but Beth wasn't finished. She turned to face the people in the pews and began to speak, still in that older voice with the Scottish accent. My name was Morag MacLeod, she said. I lived in the Highlands of Scotland until 1823, when they came for me with fire and rope. I was guilty of healing the sick with herbs and helping women birth their babies safely. For this, they called me witch. More gasps echoed through the church. This was impossible. Beth was 8 years old and had never left West Virginia. I am the spirit of Morag MacLeod. The voice continued through Beth's mouth, and I live on in the blood of my great-great-granddaughter, just as the spirits of 7 other accused women live on in the children of this village. One by one, the other children began to speak in adult voices, telling stories of persecution and death in Scotland 200 years ago. They spoke with accents and used words that mountain children couldn't possibly know. The adults in the congregation looked terrified, but not of the children. They were terrified of understanding what this meant. This is devil's work, Preacher Crow shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. These children are possessed. No, said Mrs. Patterson, tears streaming down her face. They're remembering. Dear God, they're remembering what we tried to forget. That's when things went very wrong very quickly. Preacher Crow raised his Bible and began reciting an exorcism prayer. But instead of casting out evil spirits, his words seemed to trigger something much more powerful. The air in the church began to move, swirling around the children like a gentle wind. The temperature dropped so fast that our breath became visible. And then, in the shadows at the edges of the room, I saw shapes beginning to form. They were the spirits of the dead Scottish women, no longer speaking through children, but manifesting on their own. Tall, translucent figures in old-fashioned clothes, their eyes filled with centuries of pain and anger. Enough, said the spirit of Morag MacLeod, now standing beside Beth instead of speaking through her. We will not watch our descendants persecuted for the same gifts that brought us to our deaths. The church, filled with supernatural wind and the sound of voices speaking in ancient Gaelic. Preacher Crow's Bible flew from his hands, and all the candles in the room went out at once. In the darkness, lit only by the ghostly glow of the spirits, I realized that this wasn't a case of mass hysteria at all. This was a haunting that had lasted 200 years, waiting for the right moment to demand justice. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The spirits of the Scottish women didn't attack anyone, despite their obvious anger. Instead, they began to tell their stories. The real stories of what had happened to them before they fled to America. They spoke of being healers and midwives, of helping their communities survive harsh winters and terrible plagues. They told of saving countless lives with their knowledge of plants and their ability to ease pain with touch. And they spoke of the fear and jealousy that turned their neighbors against them, the lies that branded them as servants of evil, and the violence that forced them to abandon everything they'd known and loved. We came to these mountains to find peace, said the spirit of Morag MacLeod. We buried our gifts so our children could live normal lives, but gifts like ours are not meant to stay buried forever. Preacher Crow had fallen to his knees during the spirit's testimony, his face white with shock. This can't be real, he whispered. God wouldn't allow such things. And what makes you think God doesn't work through gifts like ours? Elvira asked gently. Did not Jesus himself heal the sick and speak with the dead? The spirits began to fade as dawnlight crept through the church windows. But their message was clear. The supernatural abilities awakening in Raven's Hollow weren't evil. They were a heritage that had been suppressed by fear and misunderstanding. Over the next few days, I worked with Elvira to help the affected villagers understand and control their new abilities. Some, like young Beth, could help plants grow and heal small injuries. Others could sense when people were lying or predict changes in the weather. Mrs. Patterson, it turned out, had always had a gift for knowing when someone was about to die. She'd just learned to keep it secret after too many people called her morbid. Even Preacher Crow eventually came around, though it took time. He struggled with reconciling his faith with the reality of supernatural abilities, but eventually he found a way to see them as gifts from God rather than curses from the devil. "Perhaps," he said to me one evening, "I've been so focused on fighting evil that I forgot to recognize good when it wore an unfamiliar face." I stayed in Ravens Hollow for 2 weeks, much longer than planned. When I finally left, it was a changed place. The villagers were learning to embrace abilities that had been hidden in their families for generations. Children were being taught both regular school subjects and traditional plant medicine. Adults were rediscovering old family stories that had been dismissed as superstition. Most importantly, the nightmares and strange behavior had stopped. Once people accepted their heritage instead of fighting it, the psychological symptoms disappeared entirely. I returned to Charleston and wrote my official report for the state health department. I described the situation as a case of mass hysteria triggered by social isolation and religious extremism, resolved through community counseling and conflict mediation. But in my private files, I wrote the truth. I also made some changes in my own practice. I began studying folk medicine and traditional healing methods. I learned to recognize when a patient's problems might have spiritual or supernatural roots rather than purely psychological ones. And sometimes, late at night in my office, I found myself testing whether I might have inherited any unusual abilities from my own ancestors. I never discovered any dramatic powers like the people of Ravens Hollow, but I did develop an unusually strong intuition about my patients' underlying problems. My colleagues attributed it to experience, but I suspected it might be something more. 5 years later, I received a letter from Beth Jenkins, though she signed it Beth McLeod Jenkins now. She was 13 years old and already showing remarkable skill as a healer. The letter was to invite me to the first annual Heritage Festival in Ravens Hollow, where the community was celebrating their Scottish roots and supernatural gifts openly for the first time. I couldn't attend, but I kept the letter. On the envelope, she had drawn a small symbol, the same type I'd seen carved in the dirt that first night in the village square. I framed it and hung it in my office. A reminder that the world holds more mysteries than any medical textbook could ever explain. And sometimes, when I'm working with a particularly difficult case, I find myself wondering what other secrets might be hiding in isolated communities across these ancient mountains, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the surface and see the truth underneath. The supernatural abilities that emerged in Ravens Hollow weren't evil or demonic. They were simply human potential that had been suppressed by fear and misunderstanding for too long. But they were also proof that our ancestors' stories of magic and mystery weren't just superstition, they were memories. My name is Jimmy Holloway, and I've been digging coal out of Kentucky mountains for most of my adult life. Third generation to work these tunnels, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. Black Diamond Mine sits about 20 miles outside Hazard, carved deep into the mountain where the coal seam runs thick and black. People think mining is just about swinging a pickaxe, but that's old-timer talk. We use machines now, big cutting equipment that chews through rock like it's butter. Still dangerous as hell though. Gas leaks, cave-ins, equipment failures that can crush a man in seconds. That's why I became the union rep for our crew. Somebody's got to fight for safety down here. The mine goes down 800 feet, following coal veins through limestone and shale, dark as midnight, with just our helmet lights cutting through the black. Air tastes like metal and dust, even with the ventilation system running. You get used to it after a while, but visitors always gag on their first breath down there. Consolidated Coal Company owns Black Diamond, and they care more about profit than people. Always have. Safety inspections get delayed, equipment maintenance gets skipped, and they hire replacement workers when we strike for better conditions. Been fighting them for 3 years now, ever since I took over as union rep. Carol, my wife, she's pregnant with our first baby. Due in December, she wants me to quit mining, find something safer, but union wages are the only thing keeping us afloat. Without this job, we'd lose the house, the truck, everything. Besides, somebody's got to stand up for the other guys down there. The older miners tell stories about spirits in the tunnels. Cherokee ghosts, they say. angry about their burial ground, getting disturbed when they opened the mine back in 1923. I always figured that was just superstition. Old guys trying to spook the new workers. Dead is dead. And industrial accidents happen because companies cut corners, not because of angry spirits. Thomas Sixkiller works my crew. He's Cherokee, about 50 years old, been mining longer than anyone else, still breathing. Quiet guy, keeps to himself mostly, but he knows these tunnels better than the company engineers. When Thomas talks, smart people listen. Last month, things started getting weird down there. Equipment failing in ways that didn't make sense. Gas detectors showing dangerous levels in tunnels that tested safe an hour before. Miners talking about feeling watched, hearing sounds that didn't belong underground. I documented everything, like always. Union business means keeping records, proving company negligence when somebody gets hurt. But these incidents didn't follow normal patterns. No mechanical explanation for the equipment failures. No source for the gas leaks. Just unexplained problems that seemed to target specific work areas. Thomas started finding things in the tunnels. Pottery pieces, old bone fragments, stuff that looked ancient. He said they were Cherokee artifacts, probably from burial sites. Company never mentioned any archaeological concerns when they expanded the mine. Just blasted through whatever got in their way. The whole crew was on edge. Guys who'd worked underground for 20 years suddenly jumping at shadows, checking over their shoulders every few minutes. Production dropped because nobody could concentrate. Management blamed union agitation, but I knew better. Something was wrong down there, something that had nothing to do with labor disputes. Then the accidents started. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Billy Morrison was running the cutting machine in Tunnel 7 when the thing just stopped dead. No warning, no mechanical problems, just shut down like somebody pulled the plug. Billy climbed off to check the power connections. And that's when he saw them, footprints in the coal dust beside his machine. Bare feet, adult-sized, but with toes spread wide like somebody who'd never worn shoes. The prints led from the machine to the tunnel wall and just stopped. No exit, no explanation. "Jimmy, you need to see this," Billy called out, voice shaking. I walked over with my helmet light, expecting to see boot prints from another crew member. But these were different. The impressions were deep and clear, showing 5 distinct toes. Fresh, too, dust still settling around the edges. "Must be from earlier," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Maybe maintenance crew was down here." But maintenance wore steel-toed boots, and these prints were definitely bare feet. Thomas appeared beside us, studying the tracks without saying anything. He reached down and touched the coal dust around one footprint. "Still warm," he said quietly. That sent chills up my spine. The mine stayed at 55 degrees year-round. Nothing down there should be warm except our equipment and our bodies. Billy refused to restart the cutting machine. Said something was watching him from the shadows beyond our lights. I told him to take a break, get some coffee, calm down. But when the next shift tried to operate that machine, it wouldn't start at all. Electrical systems fine, fuel good, but the engine just wouldn't turn over. 2 days later, we found more footprints, this time in Tunnel 12, near where Thomas had discovered those pottery fragments. A whole line of them, like several people had walked through during the night. Security cameras showed nothing. Motion sensors hadn't triggered, but the prints were there, clear as daylight. Company brought in investigators, thinking somebody was sabotaging equipment. They checked every inch of those tunnels, tested all the electrical systems, interviewed every miner on every shift. Found nothing wrong, no evidence of tampering. That's when the sounds started. First, it was just whispers, voices too quiet to understand, echoing from abandoned sections of the mine. Miners would stop work, listening, but the sounds always came from somewhere else, always just out of reach. Then came drumming, rhythmic and steady, like heartbeats in the darkness. "You hear that?" Danny Kowalski asked during lunch break. We all stopped chewing, listening. Faint drumming echoed through the tunnels, coming from deep underground. Ancient rhythm, not like any music we knew. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. "Ventilation system," I said. Air moving through the shafts. But I'd been down there long enough to know every sound that mine could make. This was something new, something that didn't belong. Thomas stood up slowly, tilting his head to listen. "Cherokee drums," he said. "War drums." "Come on, Thomas," I laughed. but it sounded forced even to me. "You don't really believe in ghost stories." He looked at me with those dark eyes, serious as a heart attack. "My grandmother heard drums like that before the soldiers came. Before they moved us to Oklahoma. Cherokee spirits drumming means somebody disturbed something that should have stayed buried." The temperature in Tunnel 7 dropped 20 degrees that afternoon. No explanation, no equipment malfunction. Our breath came out in white puffs, like we were standing outside in winter. Thermometers showed the change, but company engineers couldn't find the cause. That night, I went home and held Carol close, feeling our baby move inside her belly. Safe, warm house, electric lights, television humming in the background. Normal world, where footprints had explanations and temperature changes had causes. But lying in bed, listening to October wind rattle the windows, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Drumming, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the mine. Same rhythm we'd heard underground, echoing across the hills like a warning. Carol slept peacefully beside me, but I stayed awake until dawn, wondering what we'd disturbed down there in the darkness. The next week, everything went to hell. Bobby Chen was working Tunnel 9 when his carbide light started flickering. Standard procedure says, change the carbide when your light acts up. But Bobby's was fresh that morning. Then all the lights in that section started failing at once. 10 miners suddenly standing in complete darkness 800 feet underground. Emergency lighting should have kicked in automatically. Didn't happen. Battery-powered backup lights wouldn't turn on. Flashlights died the moment we switched them on. We had to feel our way along the tunnel walls, following the air current back toward the main shaft. That's when Bobby started screaming. Something grabbed him in the darkness. We heard struggling, Bobby yelling for help. Then sudden silence. When we finally got working lights down there, we found Bobby pressed against the tunnel wall like he'd been shoved by something powerful. Scared out of his mind, babbling about hands that felt like ice touching his face. "Cold fingers," he kept saying. "Cold fingers in the dark. No injuries, no evidence of what happened." But Bobby quit that day, walked out and never came back. 20-year veteran. And something in that tunnel broke him completely. The accidents got worse after that. Equipment operators reported controls moving by themselves, machines changing direction without human input. Gas detectors showed deadly methane levels in tunnels that had been safe for decades. 3 separate cave-ins in areas where the geology should have been stable. Each incident followed the same pattern: unexplained equipment failure, temperature drops, and the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. Miners started working in groups. Nobody wanted to be alone underground anymore. Thomas found more artifacts every day. Arrowheads appearing overnight in work areas that had been clean the evening before. Pottery shards, arranged in careful patterns near mining equipment. Traditional Cherokee tools placed where they couldn't be missed, like somebody was leaving us messages. "They want us to know," Thomas explained. "Want us to understand what we're digging through." I researched the mine's history at the county library, digging through old newspapers and survey records. Found something that made my stomach drop. The original 1923 survey report mentioned extensive indigenous burial sites in the area where they planned to dig. Company response was a single line: archaeological concerns noted but deemed economically unfeasible to address. They knew, Consolidated Coal knew, they were building on top of a Cherokee burial ground, and they did it anyway. 55 years of mining operations, disturbing graves, scattering bones, treating sacred ground like just another source of profit. That night, I called a union meeting to discuss the situation. Half the miners wanted to walk off the job immediately. The other half thought we were all going crazy, seeing things that weren't there. Arguments broke out, guys shouting at each other about ghosts and paychecks and family obligations. "Look," I said, trying to keep order. "Whatever's happening down there, we need to stick together. Document everything, demand safety inspections, force the company to address these incidents. But documentation doesn't help when you're dealing with the impossible." The next morning, we found Tunnel 7 completely changed. Support beams moved during the night, rearranged into patterns that looked like traditional Cherokee structures. Railway tracks bent into spiral designs. Mining equipment repositioned to create clear pathways through the workspace. No human crew could have done that work in one night. Would have taken dozens of men with heavy machinery, making enough noise to wake the dead. Security guards heard nothing. Cameras recorded nothing. But 8 hours of overnight construction had happened in complete silence. Company management arrived that afternoon, executives in clean suits walking through our muddy tunnels, looking uncomfortable and angry. They blamed union sabotage, threatened to fire everyone, and bring in replacement workers from out of state. "You people need to cut this nonsense and get back to work," said Regional Manager Harrison Price. "These ghost stories are affecting productivity." That's when it happened. While Price was standing in Tunnel 7, lecturing us about productivity and union troublemaking, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 10 seconds. Our breath turned white, frost formed on the tunnel walls, and something moved in the shadows beyond our lights. A figure stepped out of solid rock. Cherokee warrior, dressed in traditional clothing that looked hundreds of years old. Tall man with long black hair, face painted for war, carrying a wooden club decorated with feathers and beads. He looked right at Price with eyes full of ancient anger. Price screamed and ran, stumbled through the tunnels, fell twice, crawled on his hands and knees toward the elevator. We found him 20 minutes later, sitting in his car with the engine running, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. The warrior was gone. No footprints, no evidence he'd ever been there. But the air still felt cold, and something had changed in those tunnels. The spirits weren't hiding anymore. They were hunting. That weekend, Thomas took me to meet his grandmother, Mary Sixkiller. She lived in a small house near the reservation, surrounded by gardens and traditional Cherokee symbols carved into wooden posts around her property. "Your mind sits on sacred ground," she told me in heavily accented English. Burial place of warriors who died fighting the soldiers. Their spirits never found peace because their graves were disturbed. She explained Cherokee beliefs about the dead. Proper burial ceremonies were essential for spirits to move on to the afterlife. When graves were destroyed, spirits became trapped in this world, growing angry and vengeful over time. "They tried to warn your people," Mary said. "Small signs, gentle pushing, but nobody listened. Now they're done being polite." She showed me old tribal maps, drawn on deer hide and passed down through generations. The entire area around Black Diamond Mine was marked as sacred burial ground. Dozens of warriors laid to rest after battles with federal troops in the 1,832nd. Company men came here in 1923. Mary continued. "Talked to my grandfather, offered money for the land. He said no, explained about the graves. They took it anyway, claimed legal right under federal mining laws. The spirits had been angry for 55 years, but something recent had pushed them over the edge. The new tunnel expansions, deeper than ever before, had broken into the main burial chamber. The sacred heart of their resting place. Now they want justice," Mary said. "Blood for blood, or proper ceremony to put them to rest." Monday morning, I tried to convince company management to halt operations, bring in archaeologists, respect the tribal claims. They laughed in my face. "We're not shutting down a profitable mine because of Indian ghost stories," Price said via phone from his office in Charleston. He'd refused to come back to the site after his encounter with the warrior spirit. That afternoon, the spirits declared war. Every piece of equipment in the mine failed simultaneously. Cutting machines, conveyor belts, ventilation systems, emergency lighting, everything shut down at exactly 3:17 p.m. Backup generators wouldn't start. Battery-powered devices died instantly. 53 miners trapped underground in complete darkness. Emergency crews couldn't get rescue equipment working. Radio communications were dead. Even hand-crank emergency phones wouldn't function. Something was interfering with every electrical system within a mile of the mine entrance. That's when we heard the drums. Loud enough to shake dust from the tunnel ceiling, coming from every direction at once. War drums, beating a rhythm that got faster and more intense with each passing minute. Cherokee spirits appeared throughout the mine, not just one or two, but dozens of them. Warriors in traditional dress, walking through solid rock, passing through mining equipment like it wasn't there. They carried weapons, clubs, tomahawks, bows with arrows nocked and ready. The spirits ignored most of the miners, walking past union members like we were invisible. But the replacement workers, the scabs brought in to break our strikes, they ran screaming through the tunnels as invisible hands shoved them, tripped them, through rocks that came from nowhere. In Tunnel 7, where we disturbed the main burial chamber, something bigger was happening. The rock walls started glowing with strange light, and voices chanted in Cherokee language. Hundreds of voices, singing songs that were older than the mountain itself. Thomas appeared beside me in the darkness. "They're calling their warriors home," he said. "Calling all the spirits who died fighting the soldiers." The main burial chamber opened up before us like a natural cathedral. Bones arranged in careful patterns, pottery vessels holding sacred items, weapons placed beside fallen warriors. 55 years of mining damage couldn't hide the careful reverence with which these men had been laid to rest. At the center of the chamber stood the Cherokee war chief, taller than the others, wearing an elaborate headdress made of eagle feathers. His face was painted with symbols that seemed to move in the spiritual light. When he spoke, his voice echoed from every tunnel in the mine. "Your people have taken our bones and scattered our rest. Your machines have crushed our sacred places. Your greed has awakened our anger." The company executives were down there too, trapped like the rest of us when the electrical systems failed. Price huddled behind an overturned minecart, whimpering about lawsuits and worker compensation. "We offer choice," the war chief continued. "Proper ceremony to honor our dead, or we bring this mountain down on all who disturb our peace." The tunnel ceiling started cracking. Dust and small rocks rained down as supernatural force tested the mountain's stability. These spirits could collapse the entire mine, bury all of us with the bones of their ancestors. I stepped forward, heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want? How do we make this right?" The war chief looked at me with eyes that held centuries of pain. "Return our bones to sacred ground. Speak our names in ceremony. Promise that our graves will be protected from future harm." Behind me, Price started yelling about property rights and legal contracts. The spirits turned their attention to him, and the temperature around the company executives dropped so fast that ice formed on their clothes. "Choose quickly," the war chief said. "Our patience ends with the setting sun." Above ground, the sun was already touching the western mountains. It took 3 hours to convince the company executives, but the alternative was death for everyone trapped underground. Price signed papers agreeing to immediate mine closure, archaeological survey, and federal protection of the burial site. The moment he put pen to paper, the electrical systems came back online. Emergency lights flickered to life, ventilation fans started turning, and communication equipment crackled back to functionality. The Cherokee spirits gathered one final time in the main burial chamber. War Chief raised his hands, chanting in a language that was old when Columbus landed. One by one, the warriors faded into the spiritual light, their anger finally appeased by the promise of justice. Thomas and his grandmother organized the burial ceremony. Tribal elders came from Oklahoma and North Carolina, bringing traditional songs and sacred items. They gathered every bone fragment, every pottery shard, every disturbed artifact, and reburied them, according to Cherokee custom. Federal investigators arrived within a week. Archaeological survey confirmed that Black Diamond Mine sat on one of the most significant Cherokee burial sites in eastern Kentucky. The entire area was declared a protected historical location, permanently off-limits to mining operations. Consolidated Coal fought the decision in court for 2 years, but eventually gave up. Cost them millions in lost revenue. But some battles can't be won with lawyers and money. Most of the miners found work at other operations, with the union negotiating transfer agreements and retraining programs. I became a mine safety consultant, helping companies avoid the kind of problems we'd faced at Black Diamond. Carol and I had our baby in December, a healthy boy we named David. Sometimes, when I'm holding him and looking out toward the mountains, I think about the Cherokee warriors who died protecting their people. Wonder if my son will grow up in a world where companies respect sacred places instead of destroying them for profit. The spirits are still there. Hikers sometimes report seeing figures in traditional dress walking the mountain trails. Cherokee drums echo across the valleys on certain nights. But they're not angry anymore, just watchful, making sure their resting place stays protected. Thomas works for the Tribal Cultural Preservation Office now, consulting on industrial projects throughout Appalachian territory. He says the Cherokee spirits have awakened at other disturbed sites, demanding recognition and respect. "Your story started something," he told me last month. "Other companies are listening now. Other spirits are finding their voices." Last week, I got a call from a mining company in West Virginia. They're planning to expand operations near an old burial ground, and they want me to consult on cultural sensitivity issues. Smart business. Cheaper to respect the dead than fight them. But sometimes, Late at night, when the wind is blowing from the direction of Black Diamond Mountain, I hear those drums again. Cherokee warriors keeping watch over their sacred ground, ready to defend it against anyone who doesn't understand that some places are meant to stay untouched. Some battles end, but the spirits who fought them never really go away. They just wait in the darkness, protecting what matters most, making sure the dead stay properly buried and the living remember their obligations to those who came before. The mine is sealed now, grown over with weeds and mountain laurel, but if you know where to look, you can still see the old entrance. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you might hear the drums that keep the Cherokee warriors company in their eternal vigil. Some things are more important than coal. Some places are worth more than money. And some spirits are too strong to ignore, no matter how deep you try to bury them. I learned that lesson 800 feet underground, surrounded by angry ghosts and corporate greed. Best education I ever got, even if it nearly cost me my life. My name is Jimmy Holloway, and I survived the Cherokee spirits of Black Diamond Mine. But I never forgot what they taught me about respect, justice, and the price of disturbing the dead.